her last biscuit. That was all she had left, and she gave it to a stranger's dying father without a second thought. Evelyn Harper had nothing. No money, no husband. No one in this town who believed she was worth a second glance. But when two elderly strangers collapsed on her doorstep in the brutal July heat, she gave them her bed, her food, and 3 months of her life. She nearly starved doing it. Their son never even knew she existed. If this story moves you, hit subscribe right now and turn on notifications so you never miss what comes next. And drop a comment below telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's begin. The telegram arrived on a Tuesday. James Carter read it twice. Standing in the doorway of his office at the Silverhorn Ranch, the largest cattle operation in 3 counties, with the July sun hammering the dry Montana earth outside and the smell of leather and whiskey hanging in the air around him. He was a man who did not panic. He had not panicked when cattle prices dropped in '82. He had not panicked when 2 of his ranch hands quit the same week and left him short before a major drive. He was not built for panic. But his hands were shaking when he folded that telegram. Fire at the homestead. You're come now. That was all it said. He had the fastest horse in Cutter's Creek, saddled within 10 minutes. He rode hard through the afternoon heat, pushing the animal across open range and into the foothills, not stopping when his shirt soaked through, not stopping when the sun dropped and the air turned cold. He rode with one thought driving him forward like a nail. I should have gone back sooner. He hadn't been to the old homestead in 8 months. His father had told him not to come, in that particular way Thomas Carter had of telling you something without softening it at all. We're fine, boy. You've got a ranch to run. Don't make a fuss over old people. And James, who had learned long ago not to argue with Thomas Carter about matters of pride, had listened. He'd sent money instead, regular as clockwork. Enough to keep them comfortable, he'd thought. More than enough. He'd thought wrong. The homestead came into view just after midnight, and James pulled his horse to a stop at the top of the ridge, looking down into the valley. The main structure, the house he'd grown up in, the house his father had built with his own 2 hands 40 years ago, was a blackened shell. 3 walls standing, the roof caved in, a chimney reaching up into the dark sky like a broken finger. His stomach dropped through the earth. He rode down hard, dismounted before the horse fully stopped, and moved through the ruins with a lantern, calling their names. Nothing, only ash and the smell of scorched wood and the sound of his own boots on collapsed timber. Thomas, Margaret, nothing. He stood in what had been the kitchen, he could tell by the shape of the iron stove still standing amid the debris like a stubborn old soldier. And for the first time in a very long time, James Carter did not know what to do. He was 35 years old. He had built an empire from the land his father had scratched out a living on. He employed 47 men. He had never once in all of it felt as helpless as he felt standing in those ashes. Then he heard it, a light, coming from the tree line to the east a quarter mile up the slope. A small house barely more than a cabin, really with a single window glowing amber in the darkness. And from somewhere inside it, the low murmur of a voice. A woman's voice, talking soft and steady, the way you'd talk to someone who was frightened. James walked toward it. He knocked on the door, and it opened almost immediately, like she'd heard him coming up the path. And there she stood. She was young, mid-20s, he guessed, with dark hair pulled back in a simple braid and a face that was open and honest and completely without pretension. She was a heavy-set woman, broad through the shoulders and full through the middle, wearing a plain work dress that had been mended at both elbows, and she looked at him with brown eyes that were sharp and steady and entirely unafraid. "You'd be James," she said. It wasn't a question. "Where are my parents?" She stepped back and opened the door wider, and he walked through into the small front room, and there they were. His father, Thomas Carter, was asleep in the only armchair in the room, his weathered face slack with exhaustion, a patchwork quilt tucked up under his chin that was clearly not his own. His mother, Margaret, was lying on a narrow bed in the corner, the only bed, James realized, with her silver hair fanned out on a pillow that smelled of lavender, her chest rising and falling with the slow, careful rhythm of someone who had been very sick and was only recently beginning to mend. James stood very still. "Smoke inhalation," the woman said from behind him, quiet and matter-of-fact. "Your mother got the worst of it. She was inside when the fire started. Your father pulled her out, but he's got burns on both forearms and he won't let me look at them properly because he says they don't hurt." She paused. "They hurt." James turned to look at her. "How long?" 11 days. He said nothing for a moment. Then 11 days. "Yes, sir. They've been here 11 days. That's right." He looked around the room. It was small, deeply, almost brutally small for a man used to the scale of the Silverhorn. One room serving as kitchen and sitting room, the narrow bed in the corner, a wood stove that was clearly working overtime. There was a loft above with a rope ladder, and he understood without being told that this was where she slept, or where she had been sleeping before two elderly strangers arrived on her doorstep and took the only bed. There was very little food visible, a small sack of flour, some dried beans hanging from a hook near the stove, a half loaf of bread wrapped in cloth. "What's your name?" he asked. "Evelyn Harper." "Miss Harper." He reached into the inside pocket of his coat and pulled out his money clip. He counted out bills without looking at her, enough to cover a month's lodging at the best hotel in town, enough to keep a family fed for half a year. He held it out. "For your trouble." She looked at the money for a long moment. Then she looked at him. "No, thank you," she said. He kept his hand extended. "Miss Harper, I appreciate what you've done for my family, and I intend to compensate you properly." "I don't want your compensation. So if that amount isn't satisfactory, name your—" "Mr. Carter." Her voice was still quiet, but there was something in it that stopped him the same way a wall stops you. Not loud, just solid. "I didn't take your parents in because I expected to be paid. I took them in because they needed help, and I was the one standing there." "You can put your money away." James looked at her for a long moment. He was a man who was very accustomed to being obeyed. Not because he was cruel, he wasn't, particularly, but because he was wealthy and decisive, and those two things together had a way of arranging the world around a man in a very particular shape. People generally did what James Carter suggested they do. He put the money away. His father stirred in the chair. "Boy." Thomas Carter's voice was rougher than James remembered it, scraped raw at the edges, and he opened his eyes the way old men do, slowly, like it cost something. He looked at James for a long moment without expression. Then, "Took you long enough. Don't papa me." 8 months. "You told me not to come. I told you not to make a fuss." Thomas shifted in the chair and winced, and James saw the bandaging on his forearms, white cloth wrapped carefully, tied off in neat knots. Evelyn Harper's work, he understood. There's a difference between not making a fuss and not coming at all. James sat down on the wooden stool near the door because there was nowhere else to sit. "How bad is it?" "The gone." Thomas said it flat, the way he said everything. "Stovepipe went. I'd been meaning to replace it since spring. Kept putting it off." He looked down at his bandaged arms. "Stubborn old fool, Papa. I set my own house on fire. You've been running a household for 40 years. One bad stovepipe." "James." Thomas looked up at him, and there was something in his father's eyes that James had not seen there before, not in 35 years of knowing this man. Something that looked uncomfortably close to shame. "That girl gave us everything she had. Everything. You understand me? She gave your mother her bed. She gave us food she didn't have to spare. She stayed up 3 nights running when your mother's breathing went bad, sitting, right there in that chair I'm in now, just talking to her, so she wouldn't be scared." His jaw tightened. "I offered her money too. She wouldn't take it. Said it wasn't about money. I never met a person like that." James looked over at Evelyn, who had moved to the stove and was something in a small pot with her back turned, like she was trying to give them privacy. Has she eaten? He asked, low enough that only his father could hear. Thomas shook his head slowly. Not properly. Been giving most of it to your mother. I only caught on 3 days ago and raised the devil about it. She argued with me. He made a sound that might have been a reluctant laugh. Lost the argument with a 25-year-old girl. Your mother thought it was the funniest thing she'd seen in years. James sat with that for a moment. Then he stood up, went to his horse, and came back with his saddlebags. Miss Harper, he said. She turned from the stove. He set the bags on the table, not her table. Not really. Just a plank surface on 2 sawhorses. He saw now, and opened them. He had packed for a fast ride, not a long stay, but there was jerked beef, hardtack, a tin of peaches, some coffee wrapped in cloth, and half a smoked sausage. Not lavish, but real. Eat something, he said. She looked at the food. Then at him. You won't take money. Fine. But I'll be damned if I'll stand in your house and let you go hungry while you feed my parents. He kept his voice level. That's not charity, that's basic decency. Eat something. Something shifted in her expression, something small, something she tried to control, but he saw it. She was hungry. She had been hungry for a while, he suspected, before his parents ever showed up on her doorstep. Thank you, she said. She ate standing up, small careful bites, like she was trying not to seem desperate. James looked away to give her that. He spent the night on the floor near the door, his saddle blanket beneath him and his coat over him, because there was nowhere else. He'd slept in worse places. He lay awake for a long time, listening to his mother's careful breathing and his father's snoring and the small sounds of Evelyn moving around in the loft above, and he thought about 8 months. About telegrams he hadn't sent. About visits he'd been too busy to make. About a young woman who barely had enough flour to last the week, giving his mother her bed. He was up before dawn. Evelyn came down the ladder from the loft as the sky was going gray, already dressed, her braid pinned up, and stopped when she found him at the stove with a fire going and the coffee on. You made coffee, she said. Seemed like the least I could do. She looked at the stove for a moment, then at him. You know how to work a wood stove? I grew up in this valley, Miss Harper. I know how to do most things. I just haven't had to in a while. He handed her a tin cup. Sit down. She sat. He could tell it was something she didn't do often, just sit in the middle of the morning, without working. Tell me about the fire, he said. What you know. She wrapped both hands around the cup. I don't know much. I saw the smoke around supper time. I was out feeding the chickens. By the time I got down there, your mother was already on the ground, and your father was trying to go back inside. I stopped him. She paused. He didn't thank me for that. No. He's a proud man. He is, so is his son, she said. Not unkindly. Just observing. James looked at her over the rim of his cup. Is that a complaint? It's an observation. She took a sip of coffee. You were going to stand there and hand me money without asking my name first. Most people at least ask the name. He was quiet for a moment. Fair point. I'm not telling you that to shame you. She set the cup down on the table. I'm telling you because I think you're a man who generally means well, and meaning well and doing well aren't always the same thing. James Carter had not been spoken to like that directly, plainly, without softening in longer than he could easily remember. People around him tended toward agreement. They tended toward deference. It was a natural consequence of wealth and authority, and he'd accepted it so long he'd almost stopped noticing it. He noticed it now, sitting in this tiny kitchen, being assessed by a woman who hadn't eaten a proper meal in days and was still absolutely certain of her own position. You're not from Cutter's Creek originally, he said. No. Came out from Ohio 3 years ago. My husband had a land claim here. She looked at her coffee. He died the following winter. Fever, I'm sorry. So was I. She said it without self-pity, just clean and clear. But this is good land. I stayed. It's hard country for a woman alone. It's hard country for most people. She looked up at him. Your parents have been kind to me. When I first came, your mother used to wave at me from the road. That doesn't sound like much, but when you're new somewhere, and most people look through you, one person waving you from the road's everything. James felt that land somewhere behind his sternum, quiet and heavy. She never told me, he said. Probably didn't think it was worth mentioning. Evelyn stood and went to check on the pot. People don't always know which of their small kindnesses are the ones that matter most. His mother woke up around mid-morning. James sat beside the narrow bed and held her hand. And Margaret Carter, who was a woman of strong constitution and stronger opinion, and who had spent 65 years on this earth not being overly sentimental about it, looked at her son for a long, steady moment and said, "You look tired." "I rode through the night, Mama. You should have come sooner." "Mom, I'm not scolding you, James." Her voice was thin, not quite itself yet, but her eyes were clear. "I'm just saying. You should have come sooner." She reached up and patted his hand once, firmly, like punctuating a sentence. "That girl kept me alive." I know, Mama." "She sat with me. 3 nights. Talked to me so I wouldn't panic about my breathing." Margaret's gaze moved to where Evelyn was working across the room, quiet and efficient. "She told me stories. Made-up ones, I think. About places she'd like to go someday. The ocean. She's never seen the ocean." James looked at Evelyn's back. "She's got a good heart," his mother said. "The kind that doesn't come along often." "You do well to remember that." "I will, Mama. I mean it, James." Not just as a passing pleasantry. Margaret squeezed his hand once hard for a woman in her condition. "Remember it." The morning wore on. James went outside and assessed the damage to his parents' homestead in the daylight. It was worse than it had looked in the dark, which was saying something. The structure was unrecoverable. The outbuildings were intact, which was something. The well was fine. He came back inside and found his father awake and argumentative, trying to convince Evelyn that he could manage his own bandage changes. And Evelyn was standing her ground, with the particular patient firmness of someone who had done this before and was not going to be moved. "Mr. Carter, if you don't let me look at that left forearm, I cannot tell you whether it's healing or whether it's going the other direction, and I would rather know." "It's fine. You keep saying that, because it's true." "Then it won't cost you anything to let me check." She held out her hand, palm up, waiting. Thomas glared at her. Then he looked at James, who was leaning in the doorway watching this exchange with an expression he was trying to keep neutral. "Your son thinks this is funny," Thomas said. "I don't think it's funny at all, Papa," James said. "I think you should let her look at your arm." Thomas made a sound of profound displeasure and extended his left arm. Evelyn unwrapped the bandaging with careful hands, and James watched his father's jaw tighten as the wrapping came away, not from the indignity of it, he thought, but from the pain his father would rather die than admit to. The burn on the inside of the forearm was real, and it was significant, and it had been kept clean. James could see that, kept clean and properly dressed and tended. "It's healing," Evelyn said. Her voice was professional, certain. "Left is doing better than right, but you need to stop flexing this hand so much. I can see where you've been straining it. Man's got to rest," she said. "That's what a man's got to do right now." "The ranch isn't going anywhere." Thomas looked at his son again. "She always liked this?" "Since day one," Thomas said. But the edge was gone from his voice. James stepped outside into the July heat and stood looking at the ruined homestead, at the blackened walls and the caved-in roof, and he did the math that he should have done 8 months ago. His parents were old. The homestead was old. He had been sending money and convincing himself that money was the same presence, that provision was the same as care. He had been wrong about that for a long time, and it had taken 11 days in a stranger's cabin to make it undeniable. He walked back inside. "Miss Harper," he said. She looked up from where she was rinsing her hands. "I'd like to stay a while, if you'll allow it." She looked at him, a long, measuring look, the kind that took inventory without apology. "It's a small house, Mr. Carter, I noticed." There's no room for a man of your habits. I don't need much room, he said, and I learned fast. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, your parents need you. That's what this is about. Not me, not my house, them. I know that. Then yes, she said, you can stay. His father, from the armchair, said nothing. But James caught the look that passed between Tom Sawyer and Evelyn Harper, a brief, quiet exchange that told him, without a word spoken, that these two people had developed, over 11 days and considerable mutual stubbornness, something that looked very much like respect. James unrolled his saddle blanket near the door. He stayed. Over the next few days, the shape of things became clearer to him, not just the practical shape, the logistics of 3 adults recovering in a small cabin, but the deeper shape. The shape of what had been happening here while he was away running his empire. Evelyn Harper rose before the sun. She worked quietly and without complaint, milking the 2 goats she kept in the lean-to, tending the small kitchen garden out back, hauling water, keeping the woodpile stocked, managing the cooking with a kind of careful economy that told James exactly how tight things were, how precisely she had to budget every handful of cornmeal, every pinch of salt. She never said anything about the scarcity. She just managed it, with the particular dignity of someone who has decided not to be defeated by hard circumstances. She talked to his mother every morning, not the concerned murmur of a caretaker, real talk. She told Margaret about the garden, about the neighbors 3 miles east, about a book she'd read by lamplight the previous winter, and what she thought of it. And Margaret, who was getting stronger by the day, he talked back. James would sit across the room pretending to tend to something, and listen to the 2 of them, and it struck him, quietly and with some force, that his mother had been lonely. Not just since the fire. For a long time, his father watched him. Thomas Carter had always been a watcher. He didn't speak his observations, he stored them up, turned them over, and only offered them when he was certain of what he had. James had spent his whole life being watched by his father and never being quite sure of his conclusions. On the 4th day, Thomas spoke. You're different, he said. They were outside together while Evelyn was tending to Margaret, early evening, the sky going orange at the edge. James looked at him. Different, how slower? Thomas considered. You used to walk like a man who had somewhere to be. You're just walking now. I don't have anywhere to be right now. No, Thomas agreed. You don't. He was quiet for a moment. She did that. I think she does that to people. Makes the hurry fall off you. James thought about that. She's something, he said finally, not meaning to say it out loud. She is, his father said. She's something that doesn't come along very often. He looked at his son sidelong. Don't make a mess of it. But I'm not saying anything. I'm just saying don't make a mess of it. He turned back toward the cabin. Help me with this door. The hinge is loose. James helped with the door. He got the hinge set, and his father held the frame steady, and they worked together without speaking. And when it was done, his father put his hand briefly on James's shoulder just for a moment. Just long enough to mean something, and then went back inside. James stood in the fading light and looked east, toward where his ranch sat, 40 miles and a different world away. He stayed another day, and then another. On the morning of the 7th day, a wagon came up the track from the road. James heard it first and stepped outside, and he recognized the 2 men on the bench, Harrison Webb and Cole Drayden, both of them foremen out of Cutter's Creek. Men who'd worked peripheral to his operation and who he'd seen at various business dealings over the years. They pulled up and looked down at him, with an expression he couldn't immediately place. Carter, Harrison Webb said. Didn't expect to find you up here. My parents' home burned, James said. I'm here looking after them. Sure. Webb looked past him toward the cabin. That Harper woman's place? Miss Harper's, yes. Webb and Drayden exchanged a look. Not friendly. Something I can help you with? James asked. Just making the rounds, Webb said. Valley business. Didn't mean to interrupt. He gathered his reins. You planning on heading back to Silverhorn soon? When I'm ready. Only asking because there's some matters pending. Land matters. Webb's eyes came back to him, and James felt something in the look that he didn't like, something careful. Something that was choosing what to show him and what to hide. Nothing that can't wait, I suppose. When you're ready. They drove on. James stood in the track and watched them go, and the uneasiness that had moved through him when Webb looked past him at the cabin did not dissipate. It settled in quiet and cold like a stone dropped into deep water. He went back inside. Who were those men? Evelyn asked. She was at the table, hands busy with the mending, not looking at him, but he could tell by the set of her shoulders that she'd heard the wagon. Men from town, Webb and Drayden. Her hands went still for just a moment. Then continued. You know them, James said. Not a question. I know who they are. Her voice was careful, too careful for what the words actually were. Miss Harper. She looked up. What do you know about Harrison Webb? She held his gaze for a moment. Then she set down her mending and folded her hands on the table, and there was something in the deliberateness of the gesture that told him she had been waiting, maybe, for someone to ask. I know, she said slowly, that 3 families in this valley sold their land claims in the last year, and that none of them particularly wanted to. She paused. And I know who they sold to. James was very still. Say it plainly, he said. The deeds went to a holding company. Out of Helena. Her eyes stayed on his. A holding company that has your name on its paperwork, Mr. Carter. Though I suspect you may not have known everything that was being done with it. The silence in the small room was absolute. From the corner, his father's voice came quiet and even, I wondered when you'd find out, boy. James turned. Thomas Carter was sitting up in the armchair, his bandaged arms resting on the quilt, and he looked at his son with an expression that was not surprise and not anger, but something older and sadder and more complicated than either. You knew? James suspected. For a while. Thomas looked at his hands. I started looking into it about 2 months ago, before the fire. He met his son's eyes. The fire wasn't an accident, James. The cabin was very quiet. Outside, a wind was coming up off the mountains, moving through the pines, making a sound like something breathing. James stood in the middle of the small room with the weight of what had just been said settling onto him, like the roof of a burning building coming down, slow and certain and immovable. His father believed the fire was not an accident. His father had been looking into it, quietly alone, for 2 months. And a young widow 3 miles from what used to be the homestead had noticed that land in this valley was changing hands in ways that didn't add up, and she had sat on that knowledge careful and quiet while she tended his parent, while she gave them her bed and her food, while she gave everything she had to people she barely knew. James looked at Evelyn Harper. She looked back at him. I'm sorry, he said, for whatever was done with my name. Whether I knew or not, that's my name. I'm sorry. She didn't look away. You're going to want to find out the truth of it, she said quietly. Yes. And then you're going to have to decide what to do with what you find. Yes. She nodded once slowly like she was filing something away. Then I think, she said, you'd better stay a little longer, Mr. Carter. James didn't sleep that night. He lay on his saddle blanket near the door and stared at the ceiling and turned it over and over in his mind the way you work a splinter you can't quite reach, pressing at it, feeling the shape of it, understanding that it's in there and it's going to have to come out, and that the coming out is going to hurt. His name on paperwork he hadn't signed, land changing hands in ways nobody wanted. 3 families gone from this valley in a year, and a fire that his father didn't believe was an accident. He got up before the stars were fully gone and went outside and stood in the cold dark and made himself think clearly, the way he'd trained himself to think when business got complicated, stripped of emotion, stripped of assumption. Just the facts laid out flat where he could see them. What did he know for certain? His parents' house had burned. Harrison Webb and Cole Drayden had come up this road with careful eyes and careful words and had looked past him toward Evelyn's cabin, with something in their faces he hadn't liked. A holding company out of Helena had his name on its paperwork. 3 land claims had transferred. What didn't he know? Almost everything else. He went back inside when the sky started going gray and put the coffee on, and when Evelyn came down the ladder from the loft, he was sitting at the table with 2 cups and a question. "The families that sold," he said. "Tell me their names." She sat down, wrapped her hands around the cup, the Hendersons. East side of the valley, about 6 miles out. They had a good claim, good water access. They sold in October. She paused. Then the Garrity family in February. Then the Moores in April. Did any of them want to sell? No, she said it flat and clean. Clara Henderson cried when she told me. Said they'd had an offer, and then some trouble with their water rights, and then the offer again, and by the end of it, she said she didn't see another way. But she couldn't tell me exactly how it had happened. Just that it had. James held his cup and thought about water rights. Water rights were the particular lever of this country. You controlled the water. You controlled the land, and there were men who understood that and used it and felt nothing about the using. The trouble with their water rights, he said. What kind of trouble? Documentation trouble. Evelyn looked at him steadily. Someone filed a competing claim with the territorial office. Said the original survey was wrong. The Hendersons didn't have the money to fight it in court, and by the Hendersons they figured out the competing claim had problems of its own. They'd already taken the offer. Who filed the competing claim? The same holding company. James set his cup down. Show me, he said. I don't have the paperwork. But you know where it is. She looked at him for a long moment. I know a man who might. Ed Calloway. He's the land recorder over in Ridgeback, 12 miles east. He's been uneasy about some of the filings he's been asked to process. He told me so himself, 3 months ago. But he didn't know what to do about it, and I didn't either, not alone. You're not alone now, James said. She studied him the way she always did, straight on, taking inventory, not in a hurry. Like she was deciding whether to trust what she was looking at. No, she said finally. I suppose you're not. He rode to Ridgeback that morning. Ed Calloway was a small, careful man in his 50s, with ink-stained fingers and the look of someone who had been carrying something heavy for a while and was relieved, in a cautious way, to set it down. He took James into the back of the territorial office and laid 3 folders on the table and stood back like he was presenting evidence in a trial he hadn't wanted to be part of. James read for a long time. The holding company was called Silverhorn Land Trust. His name, James R. Carter, was listed as principal, and the signature on 3 separate transfer documents bore a reasonable approximation of his handwriting. Not his handwriting. A reasonable approximation. The kind you'd get from a man who'd studied a signature long enough and carefully enough and had steady hands. He turned a page and found the competing water rights claim filed against the Henderson property. Signed by a man named Pruitt, on behalf of Silverhorn Land Trust, with a notarization from a Helena office he didn't recognize. He turned another page. He found a letter, dated 5 months ago, addressed to Harrison Webb, on his own letterhead, his actual letterhead, with the Silverhorn Ranch mark at the top. Directing Webb to proceed with the acquisition program as outlined, and to ensure the previous approach was used for the remaining valley properties. It was not a letter he had written. He sat back in the chair and looked at the ceiling of Ed Calloway's small office and breathed slowly through what he was feeling, because what he was feeling was a specific and focused fury of the kind that, if he let it run, would not be useful to him right now. How long have you had these? He asked. The Henderson file came through 10 months ago, Calloway said. I processed it because the paperwork was in order, and I had no legal reason not to. But afterward I felt he stopped. Wrong about it. I kept copies. He gestured at the folders. The other 2 I copied as they came through. I didn't know what I was going to do with them. I just knew I didn't want to be the only person who'd seen them. You did right, James said. I don't know about that. Calloway looked at his hands. I processed them, Mr. Carter. I'm as much a part of. You kept records and you told the truth when someone asked. James stood. That's more than most men would have done. I need to borrow these. I'll give you a receipt. Calloway nodded. James rode back with the folders tucked inside his coat and his mind working the whole 12 miles. Webb had been with him for 4 years. Not a foreman, Webb worked adjacent, handled some of the contract arrangements, had access to correspondence, had certainly seen his signature on enough documents to study it. He had access to the letterhead. He would have known which properties in the valley were worth targeting, would have known the water rights situation for each of them, would have known how a man like James Carter, absent, focused on the larger operation. Trusting of the men around him could be used without his knowledge. And Drayden, who'd been on that wagon seat yesterday with careful eyes, looking past James toward Evelyn's cabin. He arrived back at Evelyn's in the early afternoon. His father was sitting outside in a chair that hadn't been there that morning. James recognized it from the lean-to, where it had been among some stored items, and Thomas eyed him, dismounted with the expression of a man who had been waiting and had used the wait well. Well, Thomas said. James tied the horse. Him and Drayden at minimum. They used my name and my letterhead. Forged documents. Pushed 3 families off their claims. Thomas was quiet for a moment. And your parents' homestead. On their list. The Silverhorn Land Trust paperwork shows this valley, all of it, including the original Carter property. He paused. I think they moved on the homestead when they realized I was coming back. Maybe they wanted to make sure the property changed hands before I could see what was happening. His father's jaw went tight. I think so. Thomas Carter sat with that for a long moment, his bandaged hands resting on his knees, and James watched something move through his father's face through the iron of it, the part that never showed anything, and it was grief, he realized. Clean and simple grief for the house he'd built himself 40 years ago, that had been taken from him not by accident or by God or by the ordinary cruelty of time, but by calculation. All right, Thomas said finally. His voice was steady. What are you going to do about it? First, I'm going to find out everything they've done. Every document, every family. Then I'm going to take it to the territorial marshal. James met his father's eyes. And I'm going to make it right. Every family. Thomas looked at him for a long time. That'll cost you, he said. Yes, more than money. I know. Thomas nodded once. Then you'd better get started. James went inside and spread the folders on Evelyn's table. She came and stood beside him without being asked, and looked at the documents without touching them, and he watched her eyes move across the forged signature, across the letterhead. Across the letter to Webb, and her face stayed composed the whole time, careful and still, the way a person looks when they already suspected something, and are now seeing it confirmed and are deciding how to feel about the confirmation. They were going to come for your land too, he said. Weren't they? She didn't answer immediately. Then there was an offer. About 2 months ago, a man came to the door, very polite, said he was representing a land trust looking to consolidate holdings in the valley. I told him I wasn't interested. She paused. He came back a week later. Said there were some questions about the original survey of my claim. Said I might want to consult with a lawyer. You didn't have a lawyer. No. She almost smiled, but it wasn't the warm kind. I told him I'd look into it myself. He didn't come back. I think she stopped. What? I think they moved on the homestead instead. Because your parents were there. Because the Carter name on that property was more valuable to them than mine. She looked at the letter on the table, at the forged signature with James's name under it. And because they knew you weren't around. James looked at his own name on that paper, his name used like a tool, a crowbar, something to lever open whatever they wanted opened. And the fury was there again, steady and hot and controlled. I owe you an apology, he said. She looked up at him. Not just for what was done with my name, for being the kind of man whose absence made this possible. He held her gaze. I built something large, and I trusted the wrong people to manage the edges of it, and I told myself that was good enough. It wasn't. Evelyn was quiet for a moment. Then she said simply no. It wasn't. And that was that. No cushion on it, no softening. Just the truth laid flat, the way she did everything. He found it absurdly a relief. He rode into Cutter's Creek the next morning. The town was small general store, a saloon, the land office, a church, a smithy, 40 or so houses spread along 2 streets. He knew it the way you know a place you've been adjacent to for years without ever really looking at it. He tied his horse in front of the general store and went in, and Marta Collins behind the counter looked up and straightened and said, "Mr. Carter, we didn't know you were in the area. I've been up at my parents' place." Or what's left of it. Yes, terrible thing. She arranged something on the counter unnecessarily. Just terrible. Your poor parents. They're recovering. He kept his voice easy. "Mrs. Collins, I have a question about the Harper woman." "Evelyn Harper. What do people in town say about her?" Marta Collins arranged the thing on the counter again. "Well, she's a decent enough woman, I suppose. Given, I mean. She keeps to herself mostly." "Given what?" "Well, she's just a young widow, living alone up there, heavy set. You know, the way she is." Marta's eyes cut away. "People talk, Mr. Carter. It's a small town. What do they talk about?" "Just, well, she's an odd one, isn't she? Never married again, doesn't come to socials. Keeps those goats. People wonder about a woman who lives that way. It's not entirely respectable, a young woman alone like that." James looked at her steadily. "This woman has been keeping my parents alive for 11 days, Mrs. Collins, with her own food and her own bed and her own time." While the town wondered about her respectability, he let that sit for exactly 1 second. "I'd think about what that says if I were you." Marta Collins opened her mouth and then closed it again. "He bought what he needed: flour, salt, coffee, dried beans. A side of bacon, had it boxed and loaded onto his horse, and left without further conversation. But outside on the street he ran into something worse. 3 women coming out of the dressmaker's, and from the way they stopped when they saw him, he understood they'd been watching through the window. The one in front was Dorothea Fitch, the wife of the man who ran the saloon, and she had the air of someone who considered herself the social center of Cutter's Creek and intended to keep it that way. "Mr. Carter," she said, with a smile that had nothing warm in it. "We'd heard you were back. Staying up at that Harper woman's place, are you?" "I'm staying near my parents while they recover. Of course. Though it is interesting, the arrangement." Dorothea's eyes were bright and assessing. "A man of your position staying at a well. People are going to talk, Mr. Carter. You understand. A woman like that and a man like you." "A woman like what exactly?" Dorothea blinked. She hadn't expected the interruption. "Well, she's not exactly." "Finish the sentence," James said. His voice was level. "I'd like to hear you finish it." She didn't finish it. The smile on her face, but the certainty behind it flickered. "Miss Harper," he said, "kept my mother breathing when my mother was too sick to breathe on her own. She gave up her bed and her food and 3 months of sleep to care for 2 people she barely knew, without asking for anything in return. She is the most decent person I have encountered in this county, and I will not stand on this street and listen to her name spoken in that tone by anyone." He held Dorothea Fitch's gaze. "Do I make myself clear?" The silence on the street was absolute. Dorothea's smile was gone now. "Quite clear," she said tightly. He touched the brim of his hat and walked back to his horse. He could feel the eyes on his back all the way down the street. He got back to Evelyn's by midday and found her outside in the kitchen garden, and she looked up when he rode in and read something in his face that made her straighten. "What happened?" "Nothing serious. He unloaded the supplies from the horse." "Brought you things?" And I had a conversation in town. About me. Dorothea Fitch had opinions. Evelyn went back to the garden. She always does. I told her to keep them to herself. Evelyn stopped. She turned and looked at him with an expression he couldn't entirely read, not gratitude, or not just gratitude. Something more complicated. You didn't have to do that. I know I didn't have to. It'll make people talk more. A man like you defending. Evelyn, he used her first name without thinking, then noticed it, and didn't take it back. I'm not interested in what Dorothea Fitch thinks of me or of you. I'm interested in what's right. He held her gaze. Can I bring things into the kitchen, or are we going to stand out here in the sun arguing about it? She looked at him for another moment. Then the corner of her mouth moved, just slightly. You can bring them in. That evening, after supper, a real supper now, with the bacon and the beans and actual cornbread, and his mother at the table for the first time, thin and careful but present, Thomas Carter told a story about the year he'd built the homestead. He'd been 28 years old, he said, and he'd had less lumber than he needed and no money to get more, and a wife who was 4 months along, and it was October. So I took what I had, Thomas said, and I built what I could, and I figured I'd solve the lumber problem when the lumber problem arrived. He looked at his coffee. The lumber problem arrived on a Tuesday, as I recall. A foot of snow on the ground. Your mother in labor. Thomas, Margaret said. What? It's a good story. The boy should know where he comes from. He knows where he comes from. He knows the cleaned-up version. Thomas looked at James. I had to ride 12 miles in the snow and wake up a man I barely knew and ask to buy wood on credit from a man who had no particular reason to trust me. And he said yes. He picked up his coffee cup. I never forgot that. Man didn't know me. Didn't owe me anything. Just said yes. He looked across the table at Evelyn. Some people are built that way. Evelyn looked at the table. James watched a flush move up her neck. It's not anything special, she said. It's just what a person does. No, Thomas said, firmly and finally. It isn't. It's what you do. Don't minimize it. She didn't answer. But she didn't look away either, and James saw something settle in her, something that had been braced for a long time, very slightly, relaxed. He helped his mother back to bed after supper. She held his hand for a moment before he left. Sit down, she said. He sat on the edge of the narrow bed. The girl, Margaret said. Mama, let me say it. The girl is alone. She has been alone for 3 years, and this town has treated her badly, and she has not let it make her small. His mother's eyes were on him, serious and clear. She thinks she doesn't deserve much, James. People who've been treated the way this town treats her, they start to believe it after a while. Even the strong ones. She paused. She deserves someone who sees her. I see her. Do you? Yes. Margaret considered him for a moment with the expression she'd always had, the one that meant she was deciding whether he was telling the truth or just what he thought she wanted to hear. Good, she said. Then act like it. He went back out to the main room. Evelyn was washing the supper dishes, her back to him, her braid falling over one shoulder. She moved with the same efficiency she always moved, with no wasted motion, no complaint, just steady and capable, and entirely herself. He picked up a cloth and started drying. She glanced at him sideways. You don't have to do that. I know. She looked at him a moment longer, then looked back at her work. They washed and dried in silence, and it was not an uncomfortable silence. It was the kind of silence that happens between people who are learning that they can simply be in the same space, and that's enough, and that's more than either of them had quite expected. He dried the last dish and set it on the shelf. Evelyn, he said. I'm going to need a witness for the marshal. Someone who saw the agents, who knows the valley, who the families trust. He paused. It would be useful if that person were you. She stopped. Set the last cup on the drying board. Turned and looked at him. You're asking me to go with you to the territorial marshal? Yes. To testify against men who worked for you. Who worked for me. Past tense. She looked at him steadily. That's not a small thing to ask. No, he agreed. It isn't. And I wouldn't ask it if I didn't think you were the right person. The families trust you. The families don't trust me yet, and they shouldn't entirely, not until I've shown them something. But they trust you. He held her gaze. I need you, Evelyn. This valley needs you. She was quiet for what felt like a long time. Outside, the wind moved through the pines. His parents' breathing, slow and even, came from the corners of the small room. I'll need to arrange for someone to check on the goats, she said finally. I'll handle it, and we go to the Hendersons first. Before the marshal. I want Clara Henderson to know what we found. She deserves to know. Agreed. And James. She said his name the same way he'd said hers without planning it and then without taking it back. When we do this, you're not doing this for me. You understand that. You're doing it because it's right. Yes, he said. I know the difference. She held his gaze one more moment. Then she nodded. Good, she said. We leave at first light. But first light brought something none of them had expected. James was already up when he heard the horses, not one, not two. Several, coming up the track from the road at a pace that was not a friendly call. He stepped outside into the cold gray morning and counted 4 riders, and recognized Harrison Webb at the front with Cole Drayden on his left, and 2 men he didn't know on either side. And all 4 of them had the look of men who had spent the night deciding something and had come to an answer. Webb pulled up 10 feet from the door. He looked down at James with an expression that had shed the careful pleasantness of 2 days ago and replaced it with something harder and more honest. Carter, he said, glad we caught you before you headed out. James stood with his arms loose at his sides. Webb. We'd like to talk. Private. His eyes moved to the cabin door behind James. Without your company. Anything you say to me, you can say here. Webb looked at him for a long moment. Then he looked at Drayden, and Drayden looked back, and something passed between them that James clocked carefully. There are some documents you've been looking at, Webb said. Over in Ridgeback. Ed Calloway's been talking when he shouldn't be talking. He paused. We think there's been a misunderstanding about those documents. About what they mean. I read them very carefully, James said. I don't think there was any misunderstanding. Carter. Webb's voice shifted lower, harder, dropping the pretense of pleasantness entirely. You're a smart man. You've built something real here. You don't want to make a mess of your own operation over a bunch of paperwork that. Over paperwork with my forged signature, James said. On letters I didn't write, authorizing land fraud carried out in my name. Webb's jaw tightened. 3 families, James said. And my parents' homestead. Your parents' place was an accident. Was it? The 2 riders on either side of Webb moved their horses slightly. A small movement. A positioning movement. James noted it without looking directly at it. The cabin door opened behind him. He didn't turn around. He heard the step, felt the presence beside him, and without looking he knew it was Evelyn. She came and stood at his shoulder, and he heard her breathing steady, controlled, and she did not say a word. Just stood there. Webb looked at her. Something moved in his face that was unpleasant to see. Miss Harper, he said, you should step back inside. I'm fine where I am, she said. This is between. I heard what it's between. Her voice was clear and level. You're asking Mr. Carter to be quiet about crimes carried out with his name. In front of his parents' property and 3 families who didn't want to sell. She held Webb's gaze without flinching. I think he's going to decline. Webb looked at James. You'd let a woman speak for you? She's not speaking for me. James kept his voice flat. She's just saying what I was about to say. He took 1 step forward, just 1. Enough to make it clear that he was not stepping back. Get off this land, Harrison. You and your men. And then go back to Cutter's Creek and start thinking very carefully about what comes next. Because the marshal's office is going to hear about every document in those folders, and every family that was moved off their claim, and every piece of paper with my name on it that I didn't sign. He paused. And they're going to hear it from me today. Webb looked at him for a long moment. His hands were on his reins, tight. Then he looked at Evelyn, and the look he gave her was the look of a man filing something away for later, and James felt a cold, specific anger move through him at that look. "This isn't finished," Webb said. "No," James agreed. "It isn't. Not by a long way." He held the man's gaze. "But it's finished for right now. Get off this land." Webb turned his horse. The 4 riders went back down the track in a tight group, not hurrying, taking their time, the way men do when they want you to know they're leaving, because they choose to, and not because they have to. James stood and watched them go. Evelyn stood beside him. When they were gone, she let out a single slow breath, controlled, like she'd been holding it, like she'd been very determined not to let it show, and James turned and looked at her, and she was pale under the steadiness of her expression. Her jaw set, her eyes tracking the riders down the track. "You didn't have to come out," he said quietly. "I know," she said. "They'll remember it, that, too." She met his eyes. "But you were standing alone." He looked at her for a moment. She looked back at him with those steady brown eyes, and something in his chest made a sound, quiet and interior, like a door opening that had been shut for a very long time. "Go get your things," he said. "We leave in 20 minutes. "What about your parents?" "I spoke to Alma Birch down the road yesterday. She'll look in on them. I squared it." He paused. "You told me you needed someone to check on the goats." She blinked. Then something crossed her face, surprise, and something behind the surprise that was softer and more complicated. "You arranged all that already." Last evening. He held her gaze. "I said I'd handle it." She looked at him for another moment. Then she turned and went back inside, and he heard her moving through the small cabin, heard his father's voice asking something, and her voice answering. Heard his mother say her name, with a warmth that was more than warmth, that was something closer to love. He tightened the saddle on his horse and thought about Webb's face when he'd looked at Evelyn. About the way Dorothea Fitch had said a woman like that. About a valley full of people who had looked through this woman for 3 years and called it respectable. He thought about 3 families with forged documents and empty land claims. He thought about a holding company with his name on it, doing things he had never sanctioned and never seen. He thought about his father's house, burned to the ground. He put his boot in the stirrup and swung up and waited. Evelyn came out of the cabin in her good coat, which was not very good but was clearly the best she had, and she had her braid pinned up under a plain hat, and she carried a small bag over her shoulder. She paused at the door and looked back inside. "We'll be back by nightfall," she told his parents. "Alma Birch will be here by 8. Don't rush on our account," Thomas called back. "We're not helpless." "I know you're not," she said. "I'm telling you anyway." She came to where James held her horse. He'd saddled it while she was inside, using tack he'd located in the lean-to, and he held the animal steady while she mounted, because the horse was older and needed holding. And when she was up, she looked down at him, and for a second neither of them said anything. "Thank you," she said. "For the horse." "It's your horse," he said. "For saddling it." He handed her the reins. "Let's go get those families their land back." She held his gaze one more moment. And then she turned the horse and rode, and he swung up on his own and followed, and they rode out together into the wide Montana morning with the folders inside his coat and the whole weight of what needed to be done riding with them. And Cutter's Creek waiting somewhere ahead with all its opinions and all its careful silences and all its willingness to look the other way. He rode beside her, not ahead of her. She noticed. He saw her notice. She didn't say anything about it. She didn't have to. They rode the 12 miles to Ridgeback in the early morning cold, and James told Evelyn everything on the way. Not the edited version. Not the version where he came out looking like a man who'd been deceived through no fault of his own. The full version, how long Webb had worked adjacent to his operation, How many times James had signed documents without reading them closely enough? How many times he'd trusted the summary instead of the source material? How many times he'd told himself that's why you hire good men, so you don't have to watch every detail? Evelyn listened without interrupting. That was something he'd noticed about her. She listened the way very few people actually listened. Like, what you were saying mattered, and she wasn't spending the time you were talking figuring out what she was going to say back. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. "You're telling me this so I understand how it happened," she said. "I'm telling you so you have the full picture. Before we walk into that marshal's office. Because if there are questions you can't answer cleanly." "There might be. Yes." She nodded slowly, right. She looked straight ahead. "Then we tell the truth exactly as it is. The parts that make you look careless and the parts that make Webb look criminal. All of it. That's what I intend." "Good." She glanced at him. "Because I won't help you if you're planning to shape it." "I know that," he said. "That's why I told you the whole thing." She looked at him for a moment longer. Then she turned back to the road, and he saw something in her profile, something that had been braced, very slightly. That eased. Clara Henderson answered the door before they finished knocking. She was a woman in her 40s, raw-boned and direct, with the particular look of someone who had been waiting for something without knowing what she was waiting for. She saw Evelyn first and her face opened. Then she saw James and it closed again, fast the way a door closes when the wind catches it. "Mrs. Henderson," James said. "My name is James Carter." "I know who you are." Her voice was flat and hard and entirely controlled. "What do you want? May we come in? Give me one reason why I should let you through that door." "Because," James said, "the man who took your land forged my signature to do it. And I'm here to tell you that, and to ask what I can do to make it right." Clara Henderson looked at him for a long time. Then she looked at Evelyn. "Is that true?" she asked. "I've seen the documents myself," Evelyn said. "All of it, Clara. The competing water claim, the forged letters." "It wasn't him." Clara's jaw tightened. She stepped back from the door. They sat at her kitchen table, Clara, her husband, Frank, James, and Evelyn, and James laid out what he knew, document by document, as clearly and directly as he could. Frank Henderson didn't say much. He sat with his elbows on the table and his hands folded, and with the look of a man who is deciding whether to believe something he very much wants to believe. At the end of it, Clara said, "Can we get it back, the land?" "That's what I intend to find out," James said. "The claim was made on false documentation. If the marshal's office verifies the forgeries, the transfer should be contestable." He paused. "I won't promise you the outcome, but I'll promise you I'll fight for it. With my own lawyers and my own money, and you won't see a bill." Frank Henderson looked up. "Why? Because it was done with my name," James said. "Whether I knew or not, my name was the weapon. That's my responsibility." Frank and Clara looked at each other across the table, the particular look of people who have been married long enough that the look is a whole conversation, and then Frank looked back at James and said, "All right. What do you need from us?" "The Garrity farm." The more property. 2 more kitchen tables. 2 more conversations that cost him something. Because they should. Because these were people who had been taken from, and he was the name that had been used to take from them. And no amount of good intentions changed the shape of that. By midday, they had 3 signed statements and the support of all 3 families for the marshal's investigation. And then they rode into Ridgeback. The territorial marshal's office was a narrow building on the main street with a single barred window in the front and a man named Gil Archer behind the desk. Archer was somewhere around 50, gray through the beard, with the unhurried quality of a man who has seen enough that very little surprises him. He looked at James when they came through the door, with a neutral, measuring expression. "Carter," he said. "Been a while, Marshal. I need to report a fraud." "Multiple counts." James put the folders on the desk. "Land fraud, document forgery, and I believe arson." Archer looked at the folders, then at James, then at Evelyn, who had come in behind him and stood quietly to his left. "Sit down," Archer said. They sat. James talked. Archer read, slowly and carefully, not rushing through it, asking questions when he needed to, and not asking them when he didn't. Evelyn answered 2 questions directly about the visit from the land agent 2 months before, about what she'd observed in the valley over the past year, and she answered them the same way she did everything, straight and clear, and without embellishment. At the end of it, Archer sat back in his chair and looked at the documents spread across his desk. "You understand," he said to James, "that this implicates your operation." "My name is on the documents," James said. "I know what it looks like. I'm telling you what it is, and you're willing to testify to the forgery." "I am. You'll need a handwriting expert. I'll arrange one." Archer was quiet for a moment. "Webb and Drayden, they came to see you this morning." "Yes. They'll know you came here. They already know. They came to the Harper property before dawn trying to persuade me not to." James kept his voice even. "They didn't succeed." Archer looked at Evelyn. "And you, Miss Harper. You understand that if these men are watching the Carter situation, they may consider you a problem." "I've been considered worse things by this county," she said. "I'll manage." Archer almost smiled. Almost. He straightened the folders into a careful pile. "I'll need to send a deputy to Cutter's Creek today," he said. "I'll want Webb and Drayden located and watched before they have time to arrange their affairs." He looked at James. "I'd recommend you stay close to Ridgeback tonight. Both of you. I don't want either of you on that road after dark until I've got men in position." James looked at Evelyn. She looked back at him and said, "Your parents?" "I'll send word to Alma Birch. She'll stay the night." Evelyn was quiet for a moment. Then all right. They found a boarding house. 2 separate rooms, which James arranged without discussion, because it was the obvious and only decent thing to do, and the woman who ran it, a Mrs. Patricia Wolfe, spare and efficient, and not particularly interested in other people's business, gave them keys and pointed them toward the dining room. They ate supper across from each other at a small table, and the conversation was quiet and ordinary about the Hendersons, about what Archer had said, about the handwriting expert James would need to locate. Practical things. The kind of conversation that happens between people who are working on the same problem. But somewhere in the middle of it, Evelyn set down her fork and said, without preamble, "When this is over." "What happens?" James looked at her. "To you," she clarified. "Your operation. Your reputation. You're the name on those documents, James. Even when the truth comes out, and I believe it will, people remember the name first. They'll remember Silverhorn Land Trust and your name on it, and some of them won't follow the story far enough to understand the rest." He was quiet for a moment. "I know that doesn't bother you?" "It bothers me," he said. "It doesn't stop me." She looked at him with that steady inventory look. "Why not?" "Because stopping would be the wrong thing to do." He held her gaze. "And I've already done enough wrong things by looking away. I'm not interested in doing more." She looked at him for another moment. Then she picked up her fork again. "Good," she said quietly. Just that. He slept poorly in the boarding house room and was up before the sun, which seemed to be becoming a habit. He was dressed and had his boots on when the knock came at his door, not the soft knock of someone being considerate of early morning, but a hard, fast knock that meant something. He opened the door. It was Evelyn, already dressed, her face composed but her eyes sharp. "There's a man downstairs," she said. "He rode in 20 minutes ago. He's asking for you." "Who?" "He says his name is Pruitt." James went very still. Pruitt, the name on the competing water rights claim. The notarization from the Helena office. "Did he say what he wants?" "He says he wants to talk before things go any further." She paused. "He says he has information you need. About Webb." James looked at her. She looked back at him. "He came alone?" James asked. "As far as I could tell." "All right." He reached for his coat. "Stay up here." "No, Evelyn." He knows my name is connected to this." Her voice was quiet and absolutely final. "If he's here to talk, he talks in front of both of us. If he's here for something else, you shouldn't face it alone." He looked at her for one long moment. Then he put on his coat. "Stay behind me," he said. "I'll stay beside you," she said. "It's not the same thing." Pruitt was a thin man, around 40, with a lawyer's careful hands and a face that had the particular exhaustion of someone who had been a bad arrangement for long enough that getting out of it was starting to look worth whatever it cost. He was sitting at the dining room table with a cup of coffee he wasn't drinking, and when James came in, he looked up, and his eyes went to Evelyn, and then back to James, and he said nothing for a moment. "Mr. Carter," he said finally. Mr. Pruitt James sat across from him. Evelyn sat at James's right, and Pruitt registered it without comment. "Talk. I work for a law office in Helena. I've been retained by Harrison Webb to handle the legal structuring of the Silverhorn Land Trust." He turned the coffee cup in his hands. "I did not know, at the start of this arrangement, that the signature on the founding documents was forged." "I want to be clear about that. When did you know?" James asked. "About 6 months in." Pruitt's jaw tightened, by which point I was in it deeply enough that Webb made it very clear what the cost of walking away would be. "I was named in the documents. If it came apart, it would look—" He stopped. "It looked like I was complicit from the beginning. Which is what he intended. And now you're here." "And now I'm here." He looked at James directly. "Because I heard what happened this morning at the Harper property. And because 2 of my associates in Helena have told me that Webb has been in contact with them about expediting certain matters. Before they can be properly examined. Expediting what matters?" Pruitt reached inside his coat and drew out a leather folder. He laid it on the table. "The original documents," he said. "The ones Webb filed with the territorial office. The ones with your forged signature." He paused. "Webb is having them replaced, as we sit here. There's a man in the territorial office in Helena, a clerk named Borden, who is being paid to substitute clean documents. Documents that will show a legitimate transfer of authority, with what will appear to be a properly notarized signature from you, dated 14 months ago." The dining room was absolutely silent. James looked at the leather folder. Then at Pruitt. "He's destroying the evidence," James said. "He's replacing it," Pruitt said. "Which is worse. Because replacement leaves no gap. The records will show exactly what he needs them to show, and the originals, the forged ones, will simply cease to exist." When today his man left for Helena last night. If your marshal sends someone to pull the original territorial records, they'll find the substitutes. James finished. "Yes," Evelyn said quietly but with absolute precision. "But you have the originals." Pruitt looked at her. "That folder," she said. "Those are the documents before they were filed." "The real ones." "Yes," Pruitt said. James looked at the folder. Everything in it, everything Pruitt had just described, everything that proved the fraud was in that folder, and Webb knew it, and Webb was at this exact moment making the official record disappear. "Why are you giving us this?" James asked. Pruitt was quiet for a moment. "Because I was a lawyer once," he said, "before Webb. And because I have a daughter." He looked at the table. "She's 12 years old. I don't want to look at her in 10 years and be the man who let this stand." James reached across the table and took the folder. "You wasn't a question." "Yes." Pruitt exhaled slowly. "Yes." James stood. Evelyn was already standing. He looked at her, and she looked at him, and he could see it in her face, the same understanding he was arriving at, sharp and clear. "We need to get to Archer right now," she said. "We need to get to Archer, and we need to get a wire to Helena to stop that clerk before those records are substituted." He was already moving. He looked back at Pruitt. "Come with us, right now. Don't go back to your room. Don't go outside alone. Come with us directly to the marshal's office." Pruitt stood and buttoned his coat, with hands that were not quite steady. They walked through the early morning streets of Ridgeback, 3 abreast. and James held the leather folder under his arm and felt the specific urgency of a clock running down, and Evelyn kept pace with him exactly, stride for stride. Not running but moving fast, and Pruitt came just behind them. Archer was already at his desk. He looked up when they came through the door, 3 people, moving fast, with a particular expression on their faces, and he straightened immediately. What happened? James put the folder on the desk. Webb is having the territorial records in Helena replaced today. His man left last night. You need to wire Helena now and have a marshal hold that clerk, his name is Borden, before he makes the substitution. Archer was already on his feet. Who's this? Pruitt. The lawyer who set up the holding company. He has the originals. He'll testify. Archer looked at Pruitt for exactly 2 seconds, the look of a man measuring weight, and then he turned to the door of the back office. Henderson, a deputy, appeared. Get on the wire to Helena Marshal's office, urgent. Hold a clerk named Borden at the Territorial Land Office, pending investigation. Do not let him file or substitute any documents. Go. The deputy went. Archer turned back to the room. Sit down, all of you. Start from the beginning, and don't leave anything out. They talked for 2 hours. At the end of it, Archer had deputies on the road to Cutter's Creek, a wire sent to the territorial marshals in Helena, and an appointment with a judge in Ridgeback for the following morning to secure warrants for Webb and Drayton. He also had Pruitt's full statement, signed and witnessed, and the folder of original documents in his evidence lockbox. He looked at James when they finally stood to leave. Webb came to your parents' property this morning to warn you off, Archer said. And you came here anyway. Yes, that took something. It took less than it would have taken to live with not doing it, James said. Archer looked at Evelyn. And you, Miss Harper. You rode to the Henderson place and the Garrity place and the poor place this morning and got their statements. Someone had to, she said simply. You've been paying attention to this valley for a while, he said. Before Carter knew what was happening. I live here, she said. You pay attention to where you live. Archer looked between the two of them. I'll need you both available for the next few days. The judge will want testimony. Don't go far. They walked out into the late morning and stood on the street of Ridgeback, and James let out a long breath that he'd been holding, it felt like, since that folder landed on Archer's desk. Evelyn stood beside him and did the same thing, one slow, deliberate exhale, like setting something down. Borden, she said, do you think they'll stop him in time? Archer's wire went out within 20 minutes of Pruitt telling us, James said. If Helena moves fast, if. She looked down the street. And if they don't, if the originals are gone, then we still have Pruitt's copies and Pruitt's testimony and the statements from 3 families and Ed Calloway's records. He looked at her. It's not over if the substitution happens. It's harder. But it's not over. She nodded slowly, then she said, I want to go back. To your place. To your parents. She looked at him. They've been alone long enough, and Alma Birch is kind, but she's not family, and... Yes, he said, we go back. They stopped at the boarding house to collect their things, and James paid Mrs. Wolf for both rooms, and Evelyn started to object, and he said don't, and something in his tone made her stop. Not because he was being commanding about it, but because he said it the way you say something to a person you don't want to argue with, and she heard the difference. They rode back the 12 miles in the afternoon, and it was different from the morning ride. The morning had been urgent and purposeful and tightly wound with everything that needed to happen. The afternoon was something else, quieter, less defined, carrying all the weight of what had been done and what still needed doing, but without the immediate forward motion to keep them from feeling it. About halfway back, Evelyn said, Pruitt's daughter. 12 years old. What about her? He said it like it was an explanation. For why he came. She was quiet for a moment. I believed him. So did I. That surprises me, she said. I would have thought you'd be harder on him. He was in it. He was in it and he got out when he found a way, James said. I'm not going to make him pay for getting out. He paused. I've spent more time than I should judging people for getting into the wrong arrangement. Turns out it's not always a simple choice. If the wrong arrangement has your name in it, and a way to make things bad for you if you walk. Evelyn glanced at him. Speaking from experience. Speaking from the last 3 weeks, he said. My name was in it too. I didn't choose to put it there, but it was there. And when Archer looked at me this morning just for a second, before he understood, I felt what that looks like from the outside. He kept his eyes on the road. I don't want to make any man feel that way if I can help it. She was quiet for a moment. You're different than I thought you were, she said. When did you decide what you thought I was? When you came to my door at midnight with your hand out. She almost smiled. Rich man, big gesture, no name. That was a bad night for me. You were still deciding whether money fixed everything. I wasn't sure it didn't, he admitted. And now? He thought about his father's face in the armchair. About his mother holding his hand and telling him to act like it. About Clara Henderson at her kitchen table, asking can we get it back with so much controlled hope in her voice that it was almost hard to look at. Now I know what fixes things, he said. And it isn't money. Money is part of it. But it isn't the engine. She looked at him. What's the engine? Showing up, he said. Being there. Doing the thing yourself instead of paying someone else to do it and calling it done. He glanced at her. Something you already knew. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, I'm not better than you for knowing it. I knew it because I had to. I didn't have money to send instead of myself. Maybe, he said. But you could have used that as an excuse to stop caring about other people's problems. A lot of people do. She didn't answer that. They rode the rest of the way without talking much, just the sound of the horses and the wind through the grasses and the long light of the Montana afternoon going gold around them. They were a mile out from the cabin when James saw the smoke. Not the black billowing smoke of a fire, a thin thread of gray-white smoke from the chimney which was normal. But beside it, from the direction of Evelyn's lean-to, where the goats were kept, a different smoke. Darker. Small, he felt Evelyn go rigid beside him. That's not the chimney, she said. He was already pressing his horse forward. They rode in fast and came around the side of the cabin, and the lean-to was on fire. Not fully the structure was standing. The fire was at one corner, but it was burning, and one of the goats was loose and running in circles in the yard, and Alma Birch was standing outside the cabin door, with both hands pressed to her mouth. James was off his horse before it stopped. He grabbed the water bucket hanging on the post full. Thank God. Evelyn kept it full and hit the burning corner with it and called back, Is there another bucket? And Evelyn was already running with a second one, moving fast and without panic, and between the two of them and the third bucket, from the well they had it out in 4 minutes. 4 minutes. He stood looking at the charred corner of the lean-to, breathing hard, with Evelyn beside him, and she was looking at it too, and the goat was still running in circles behind them, and at some point Alma Birch had started crying. I'm sorry, Alma said. I'm so sorry. I stepped inside for just a minute, and when I came back out the corner was... It's all right, Evelyn said. She turned and went to Alma and put a hand on the woman's arm. Alma, look at me, it's all right. The goats are fine, the cabin is fine, she paused. How did it start? Alma wiped her eyes. I don't know. I don't smoke. I didn't have any fire near there. I can't understand how. James walked to the charred corner. He crouched down. He looked at the base of the burned wood, at the pattern of the char, at the ground around it. There was a smell that wasn't wood smoke. He picked up a piece of scorched wood and turned it over in his hands and smelled it again and felt something go cold and focused in his chest. Lamp oil. He stood up and looked back down the road they'd come in on, the road to Cutter's Creek. James Evelyn's voice was quiet and close. She'd come to stand behind him. What is it? He showed her the wood. Let her smell it. He watched her face change. Or Webb Drayton. He set the wood down. A message. He looked at her. Not meant to hurt anyone. meant to warn. He's telling you he can reach me here, she said. Even while you're away. Yes. She was very still for a moment. Then she said, I'm not afraid of Harrison Webb. I know you're not. He looked at her steadily. But I am. On your behalf. He paused. I need you to let me do something about that. She looked at him. What? She said. I need you to come back to Silverhorn with me. Not because you can't manage here. Not because you need. James, my parents need to go somewhere safer while this plays out. I can't take them to Silverhorn without you. My mother won't go without you. He held her gaze. And I need to know you're not here alone on this road while Webb and Drayden are still at large. He paused. I'm asking, not telling. She looked at him for a long time. The goat finally stopped running and stood near the well looking offended. Alma Birch had composed herself and was watching them both with an expression she was trying to make neutral. Evelyn looked at the lean-to, at the charred corner, at the road. Then she looked at James. Your parents have to want to come, she said. They'll want to come. And I keep my independence when we get there. I'm not, yes, he said. Completely. She pressed her lips together. Looked at the road once more. All right, she said. We'll go. He let out a breath. He went inside to talk to his parents. Thomas was sitting up, and Margaret was sitting up too, and they both looked at him with the alert attention of people who had heard enough outside to know something had happened. We're going to Silverhorn, James said. Thomas looked at him for a moment. And the girl? Thomas nodded once. He didn't say anything else, but he reached for his boots with both bandaged hands and started pulling them on, slow and careful, and the message in that was plain enough. Margaret looked at her son. I told you, she said quietly. Act like it. Yes, Mama, he said. I'm trying. She patted his hand once, the way she always did, firm and final. You're doing better, she said. Outside, Evelyn was already packing. Not much, she didn't have much, but she moved through the small cabin with the efficiency of someone who had learned to carry only what mattered. She wrapped her book in a cloth and put it in her bag. She took the small tin from the shelf above the stove savings. James understood without being told every cent she had. She took the mended quilt from the chest at the foot of the bed. She paused at the door of the cabin and looked at it for a long moment, the walls, the loft, the stove that had kept 3 people alive through a Montana winter. James waited. Let's go, she said. They left before the sun was fully down, 5 people and 2 horses and 1 deeply indignant goat that James had agreed, without being fully sure how it had happened, to transport in the back of a borrowed wagon. Alma Birch saw them off from the road and waved until they were out of sight. The road to Silverhorn was long and the wagon was slow, and Thomas sat in the wagon bed with his boots dangling, and Margaret sat beside him, wrapped in the patchwork quilt, and somewhere around the 3rd mile Thomas began talking. He talked about the homestead, and the year he'd built it, and the winter that followed. He talked about a horse he'd had in his 30s that could find water in a drought. He talked about a dance he and Margaret had gone to in the summer of '68 and how she'd worn a blue dress. Margaret said it was green, it was blue. Thomas, I know what color my own dress was. It was the color of the sky. The sky is not green. The sky is not. Thomas looked at Evelyn, who was driving the wagon. You tell her. Was that dress blue or green? Evelyn kept her eyes on the road. I wasn't there, Mr. Carter. Well, which does it sound like to you? I think, Evelyn said carefully, that it sounds like a beautiful dress either way. Thomas made a sound of mild outrage. Margaret laughed a real laugh, fuller than James had heard from her in years. James rode beside the wagon and listened to his parents argue about the color of a dress from 20 years ago, and he looked at Evelyn's profile in the gathering dark steady, competent. The ghost of a smile at the corner of her mouth, and he thought about what his mother had said. Act like it. He was going to. But there was something else he needed to do first. Something that could not wait for the warrants and the testimony and the legal unraveling of everything Webb had built. Something that needed to happen in Cutter's Creek, in daylight, in front of the people who had called Evelyn Harper a woman who wasn't respectable. In front of Dorothea Fitch and everyone who had made up their minds about who this woman was from 30 feet away and never once looked closer. He didn't say anything about it yet. He rode beside the wagon and listened to his family and watched the road ahead, and somewhere in the dark behind them, he knew Webb was still out there, calculating, watching, deciding whether a warning fire was enough or whether something larger was needed. It wasn't enough, and Webb, James thought, was about to find out exactly what happened when a man who had been looking away finally turned around. Silverhorn Ranch sat 40 miles east of Cutter's Creek, and James had built it over 12 years into something his father had once called either impressive or excessive, depending on his mood. Riding in through the main gate that night, with a wagon carrying 2 elderly people, 1 stubborn woman, and 1 deeply offended goat, James saw it differently than he ever had before. He saw the size of it, the distance between the main house and everything else. The way a man could live here for years and never have to reckon with anything he didn't want to reckon with, because there was enough space and enough money and enough hired hands to keep the hard parts of the world at arm's length indefinitely. He'd called that success. He was revising that opinion. Evelyn said nothing when they came through the gate. She looked at the main house 3 stories, stone foundation, wide porch, and then she looked away, back at the horses, her expression giving nothing. James had learned enough about her by now to know that the giving nothing expression was not indifference. It was the face she wore when something was larger than she'd expected, and she was deciding what to do with that. He helped his mother down from the wagon first, then his father, who accepted the help without comment, which meant he needed it. He showed them to the 2 best guest rooms on the first floor, rooms that had never been used, as far as James could remember, for anyone who actually needed them, and Margaret went to sleep almost immediately. And Thomas sat on the edge of the bed and looked around with the expression of a man who was in a place he hadn't expected to be and was taking his time about deciding how to feel. "It's a good house," Thomas said finally. "It is," James said. "Your grandfather would have called it too much. Probably." Thomas looked at his hands. "I would have said the same thing. 10 years ago." He looked up at his son. "I was wrong. It's not too much, it's just empty." He paused. "It shouldn't be empty, James." James said nothing. There wasn't anything to say to that. He went back out and found Evelyn standing in the yard with the goat on a rope, looking at the barn, clearly working out logistics. "There's a paddock on the south side," he said. "She'll be fine there. I'll have one of the hands set her up. I can manage it myself." "I know you can." He didn't move to take the rope. "But it's late and you've had a long day, and there are men here whose job it is to do exactly this. Let them do it." She looked at him. "You're going to have to get used to that," he said. "Letting people help, not because you can't do it yourself, just because you don't always have to." She held his gaze for a moment. Then she held out the rope. He took it and handed it to the ranch hand who had appeared at the barn door, and when he turned back, Evelyn was looking at the main house again with that same carefully neutral expression. "I'll show you the room," he said. He put her in the corner room on the 2nd floor, the one with the window facing east, where the morning light came in first, because she was a person who got up before the sun and he thought she'd want the light. She stood in the doorway and looked at it, the real bed, the clean linens, the washstand with the proper mirror, and her face did something she didn't fully control. He pretended not to see it. "Sleep," he said. "Tomorrow is going to be hard." "What happens tomorrow?" "The judge in Ridgeback signs the warrants at 9 o'clock, he said. "Archer will have Webb and Drayton in custody before noon. And then I need to go into Cutter's Creek." She looked at him. "Why Cutter's Creek?" "Because there are people there who need to hear something from me directly." He held her gaze. "And some of those things are about you." She went very still. "Not tonight," he said. "Sleep first." She looked at him for a long moment, with the measuring look, the inventory look. trying to determine what he meant and whether she could argue with it. He could see her deciding. "All right," she said finally. He went to his own room and lay in his own bed, a large, well-made bed he had bought, because he could. He'd thought carefully about why, and stared at the ceiling and listened to the silence of the house. It was a different silence than Evelyn's cabin. That silence had been full of people nearby, of the sounds of breathing and the stove and the horses outside. This silence was the silence of a large space with too few people in it, and he heard it now the way his father had heard it, and it made a different sound than it used to. He was up at 5. He had coffee on before the cook arrived, which startled the cook, a woman named Ruth, who had managed the Silverhorn kitchen for 7 years and was not accustomed to finding her employer in it before dawn. She recovered quickly and took over without being asked, and James sat at the kitchen table and drank his coffee and thought about the order of what needed to happen today. Evelyn came downstairs at 5:30. She stopped in the kitchen doorway and registered Ruth, and Ruth registered her, and there was a brief, assessing silence. Then Ruth said, "Coffee's fresh," and Evelyn said, "Thank you," and sat down, and that was that. James looked at her across the table. She looked back at him. "Your parents are still sleeping," she said. "Good. They need it. Your father's arms are healing well. His right forearm is further along than I expected. He hasn't been straining it as much." She wrapped her hands around her cup. "He's stubborn, but he listens eventually. That's the Carter way. I've noticed." Ruth set a plate of biscuits on the table between them and went back to her work, and James watched Evelyn take a biscuit with the careful economy of someone who still hadn't fully switched off the part of her brain that rationed food. He thought she probably didn't know she was doing it. "Eat more than one," he said quietly. She looked at him. "You don't have to ration here," he said. "There's enough." She held his gaze for a moment. Something moved through her expression, complicated, layered, the kind of thing that didn't have a simple name. Then she reached for a second biscuit. He rode to Ridgeback at 7:30 to be at the judge's office when the warrants were signed. Judge Harlan Oakes was a deliberate man who read every word of every document before him and asked 3 clarifying questions, and then signed both warrants with the decisive stroke of someone who had made up his mind and wasn't going back on it. Archer was there with 2 deputies, and he had news. The wire to Helena had reached the marshal's office in time. The clerk Borden had been stopped before the document substitution could be completed. The original territorial records were secured. James felt something in his chest release. "Webb?" he asked. "Still in Cutter's Creek, as far as my man can tell," Archer said. He didn't run, which is either very stupid or very confident. "Webb isn't stupid," James said. "No." Archer put the warrants inside his coat. "Which means he thinks he has something we don't. My advice, let me handle the arrest. Don't be in Cutter's Creek when it happens. I need to be in Cutter's Creek today." Archer looked at him. "Carter, not for Webb, for the town." He met the marshal's eyes. "There are 3 families who need to hear from me in person what was done and what's being done about it. And there are other people in that town who need to hear some things clearly stated." He paused. "I'll stay out of Webb's way, but I'm not staying out of that town." Archer studied him for a moment. "Then take someone with you." "I'll have Miss Harper." Archer looked at him with an expression that was not quite a smile but was adjacent to one. "The Harper woman," he said. "Yes." "All right." He picked up his hat. "Try not to create a second problem while I'm solving the first one." James rode back to Silverhorn, and when he got there, Evelyn was in the yard with his mother. And his mother was sitting in a chair someone had carried out, and Evelyn was sitting on the porch step, and they were talking in the easy way of people who have run out of formality and moved past it. And he stopped his horse and watched them for a moment before they noticed him. His mother was laughing at something. He couldn't remember the last time he'd seen that. He explained the warrants and the Helena news over the noon meal, and his father sat very straight and listened with the controlled expression of a man receiving information he had waited a long time to receive. And when James finished, Thomas looked at the table for a moment and then said simply, "Good." Just the one word. But the way he said it carried everything. "I'm going into Cutter's Creek this afternoon," James said, "to see the families and to settle some things." His father looked at him. "Take the girl, I intend to." Thomas nodded. He looked at Evelyn. "You let him do the talking." Evelyn raised an eyebrow. "In town." "About certain matters." Thomas picked up his coffee cup. "He needs to say some things himself, in front of people. It won't mean the same thing if it comes from you." Evelyn looked at the old man for a long moment. Then she looked at James. James said, "He's right." She pressed her lips together. "Then fine." Thomas set down his cup. "Don't make that face." "I'm trying to help you." "I know," she said. "That's why I said fine instead of arguing." Thomas Carter looked at his son with the look of a man sharing a private understanding, and James looked back at him, and neither of them said a word. They rode into Cutter's Creek at 2 in the afternoon. James went to the Henderson place first proper, in daylight, with Evelyn beside him, and Clara Henderson opened the door and looked past James immediately, at Evelyn, and said, "They got Webb?" "Warrants are signed," James said. "Marshal Archer is executing them today. The Helena records are secured. Your claim is contestable, and I have a lawyer in Ridgeback who will begin the process tomorrow morning." Clara pressed both hands flat against her sides. Her eyes filled, and she did not let them spill. "Our land," she said. "I'll get it back," James said. "I cannot promise the timeline, but I will promise you the fight." Frank Henderson put his hand on his wife's shoulder. He looked at James steadily. "We believe you," he said. He said it like it cost something, like he was a man not accustomed to extending that kind of credit, and James understood the weight of it. "Thank you," James said. "I know what that cost you to say." Frank nodded once. They went to the Garrity's next, and then the Moores, and each conversation followed its own shape, different fears, different questions, different ways of holding on to what they'd nearly lost, but at each kitchen table, James sat and answered every question directly and made every promise he intended to keep and did not make any he didn't. Evelyn sat beside him and said almost nothing, and her silence was not the silence of someone who had nothing to say. It was the silence of a person who knew that this particular thing needed to be said by this particular man, in his own voice, and she was letting him say it. He understood what his father had meant. It was past 4 when they finished with the Moore family and came back out to their horses. And James was aware of the light shifting and of the 2 hours they'd spent in those houses, and of the fact that somewhere in this town Archer's deputies were or had been executing 2 warrants, and he didn't know yet what that had looked like. He found out 2 minutes later. They were riding past the saloon when the door opened, and Dorothea Fitch came out not alone, with 4 other women, and she stopped dead when she saw them, and the expression on her face moved through 3 things very fast. Surprise, then calculation, then a kind of brittle social assembling. "Mr. Carter," she said, "we've heard there's been quite a to-do with the marshal." "Harrison, Webb, and Cole Drayton were arrested this afternoon," James said. He kept his horse still, for land fraud, document forgery, and arson. "The Silverhorn Land Trust was a criminal operation run without my knowledge, using a forged version of my signature." He looked at Dorothea directly. "I wanted the town to hear that clearly from me." Dorothea's mouth opened and then closed. Around her, the other women were very still. "And while I'm being clear," James said, "I want to say something else." He looked at Evelyn beside him. Then back at the women on the boardwalk. "Evelyn Harper kept my parents alive for 11 days, with her own food and her own bed, while I was 40 miles away not knowing they needed help. She came with me to the marshal's office with evidence she'd been collecting for months, alone, because she understood what was happening in this valley before any of the rest of us did." He paused. "She is the most capable and the most decent person I have met in this county. And I will not come back to this town and hear her spoken of with anything less than the respect she has earned. By anyone, The street was very quiet. Dorothea Fitch looked at Evelyn with an expression that was struggling between dignity and something that might, with time, turn into shame. Evelyn sat on her horse and said nothing. She didn't lift her chin in the theatrical way of a person making a point. She just sat there, straight and still and entirely herself, and that was somehow worse or better than any gesture would have been. "I see," Dorothea said. Her voice had lost its carrying quality. "Good," James said. "Then I'll say good afternoon." He touched the brim of his hat and rode on. He heard Evelyn's horse fall into step beside him. He didn't look at her. He kept his eyes on the street ahead, on the people who had stopped to watch, on the general store and the land office and the church, with the paint peeling on the south side, and he rode at an even pace through all of it, and he did not hurry. When they cleared the edge of town and the buildings fell behind them, Evelyn said, "You didn't have to do that." "I know, you did it anyway, yes." She was quiet for a moment. "Then thank you." He looked at her. She was looking straight ahead, her jaw set, her eyes bright in a way that she was controlling, carefully, the way she controlled everything. "You don't have to thank me," he said. "I know I don't have to." She turned and looked at him directly. "I wanted to." He held her gaze. Something between them had shifted over the past weeks, incrementally and then all at once, the way rivers change course, not a sudden breaking but a slow, inevitable rerouting. And you only notice when you look back and see how different the landscape is from where you started. "Evelyn," he said. "Don't," she said. "Not yet." She turned back to the road. "There's still too much unfinished. Webb's trial. The land claims. Your parents. I know. When it's finished," she said, "we can say things. When there's ground underneath it." "All right," he said. She glanced at him sideways. "That didn't sound like a man who agrees easily." "I agree when someone's right," he said. "You're right." She looked at him a moment longer. Then she turned back to the road. They were 3 miles from Silverhorn when a rider came toward them fast from the east, one of James's ranch hands, a young man named Cal, riding with the urgency of someone carrying news. He pulled up hard. "Mr. Carter, there's a man at the ranch. Came about an hour ago, said he'd wait. Says his name is Slade, came from Helena." He caught his breath. "He's got papers. Said they're from the Silverhorn Land Trust. Said he's there to execute a transfer." James went absolutely still. "A transfer of what?" Evelyn said, and she said it before James could, her voice sharp and clear. Cal looked at her. "The ranch, Miss Harper." He looked back at James. "The man has papers claiming Mr. Carter transferred the Silverhorn Ranch to the Land Trust 14 months ago. He says the ranch isn't Mr. Carter's anymore." The silence that followed was the particular silence of something that changes everything. James looked at the road ahead. His hands were very steady on the reins. Evelyn was looking at him. "James," she said quietly. "I know." He kept his voice level. The fury was there beneath the level, but he held it down because fury right now would not be useful. "It's the final play. If Webb couldn't stop me, he takes the ranch." He thought fast. Pruitt's documents, the originals, what they covered. He had the land claim documents, the water rights forgeries, the letters. But the ranch title, he hadn't thought about the ranch title because he hadn't imagined they'd gone that far. He should have imagined it. "The originals Pruitt gave us," Evelyn said. She was thinking the same direction he was. "Did they include ranch title documents?" "No, Archer," she said. "Does Archer know about this?" "He will in about 10 minutes. James looked at Cal. "Ride back to the ranch. Tell the man named Slade that Mr. Carter is on his way and will discuss the matter directly. Do not let him leave and do not let him access any buildings." "Can you do that?" "Yes, sir, go." Cal rode. James looked at Evelyn. "I need to get to Archer's man in Cutter's Creek," she said immediately. "Archer left a deputy there. If there's a deputy document from Helena tied to this." "Go," James said. "I'll ride to the ranch and slow Slade down. Get the deputy and get to the ranch as fast as you can." "James, if This is a legitimate document. It isn't. But if it appears won't hold, he said with more certainty than he entirely felt. Pruitt will know about this. He structured the trust. He'll know if a ranch transfer was part of it, and he'll know where the documents were filed. He paused. And I have 12 years of legitimate title records in my office safe. 12 years, Evelyn. Every deed, every tax record, every survey. Slade can wave his paper all he likes. She held his gaze for one more second. Then she turned her horse and rode back toward Cutter's Creek at a flat run. And James watched her go for exactly the second it took to understand that she rode like someone who had been riding since before she could walk and had never had money for the kind of horse that deserved it. He turned east and rode hard for Silverhorn. Slade was on the porch. He was a heavy-set man in a good suit, with the look of someone hired to perform a legal function and not particularly interested in the human consequences of it. He had a leather case on his knee and a neutral professional expression, and he stood when James rode in. Mr. Carter, Mr. Slade. James dismounted and tied his horse without rushing, and came up the porch steps and looked at the man directly. I understand you have documents, I do. Slade opened the leather case. A deed transfer, properly notarized, recording the transfer of Silverhorn Ranch, all associated land holdings and buildings, to the Silverhorn Land Trust. Signed by James Robert Carter on March 14, 1884. He held out the document. James took it. He read it. The signature at the bottom was very good. Better than the ones on the land claim letters, even. Someone had spent considerable time on this one. I didn't sign this, he said. The notarization is fraudulent. James handed it back. The same as every other document originating from the Silverhorn Land Trust, which was a criminal operation run without my knowledge by men who are currently in the custody of the territorial marshal. He watched Slade's face process that. I'd encourage you to consider very carefully who hired you to come here and what you know about the nature of that engagement. Slade was very still. I was engaged by the legal firm in Helena. Which firm? A beat of silence. Grantham and Associates, Slade said. James filed that name away. And who at Grantham and Associates engaged you? A Mr. Pruitt. James went absolutely still. Not the focused stillness of thinking. The stillness of something landing wrong. Pruitt, who had come to their table at the boarding house that morning with a leather folder full of originals and a story about his 12-year-old daughter and a conscience that had finally gotten loud enough to listen to. Who had sat across from Archer and given a signed statement and handed over documents he said proved everything. Who had apparently also dispatched this man. James kept his face absolutely neutral. When, he said carefully, were you engaged by Mr. Pruitt? 3 days ago, Slade said. 3 days ago. Before Pruitt had come to them. Before the boarding house. Before the folder of originals and the signed statement. Which meant one of two things. Either Pruitt had arranged this before he changed his mind and hadn't canceled it in time. Or Pruitt hadn't changed his mind at all. James heard horses coming fast up the road. He turned. Evelyn. And behind her, Archer's deputy, a young man named Rourke, who rode with the urgency of someone who'd been given a clear purpose and was executing it. They pulled up in the yard. Evelyn looked at James's face, and whatever she read there made her come off her horse fast. What's wrong? She said quietly. Pruitt sent him, James said, just as quietly. 3 days ago. He watched her process that. Watched her arrive at the same two possibilities he had. 3 days ago, she said, before he came to us. She looked at Slade, who was standing on the porch, looking uncertain in the way of a man who had arrived expecting a legal formality and found something considerably more complicated. Or, Evelyn said slowly, he sent this man 3 days ago when he was still working for Webb, and then changed his mind, and came to us, and forgot or didn't know how to cancel it. That's possible. It's also possible he came to us specifically to find out what we had and what we'd told Archer before this man arrived. Also possible. They looked at each other. One way to find out, she said. James turned to Rourke. I need you to ride Ridgeback right now and tell Marshal Archer two things. First, that a man named Slade has arrived at Silverhorn with forged transfer documents for the ranch. Second, that we need Pruitt's whereabouts confirmed immediately confirmed. In person, not by wire. He held the deputy's gaze. Tell Archer that Pruitt may have been straight with us, or he may not have been, and we need to know which, before we know what these documents mean. Rourke didn't ask questions. He was a good deputy, apparently. He turned his horse and rode. James looked at Slade. You'll wait here, he said. You're not under arrest. But you'll wait until I can verify the status of the man who engaged you. Slade looked between James and Evelyn and at the departing deputy and made the calculation a sensible man makes when he is in a situation he does not fully understand. I'll wait, he said. James went inside. Evelyn followed. They went to his office, and he opened the safe and pulled out 12 years of title records and laid them on the desk, and she looked at them, the organized, meticulous paper trail of a legitimate operation built from the ground up, and then looked at him. If Pruitt was straight, she said, this is over today. Slade's documents are fraudulent. Archer has Webb and Drayden. The Helena records are secured, and everything falls apart for them. Yes, and if Pruitt wasn't straight, she said, then he handed Archer documents that he chose. Documents that proved what he needed them to prove. And the things he didn't hand over are still out there. She sat down in the chair across from his desk, the chair that visitors sat in, clients, men who came to do business, and she looked at him with the steady, clear look she always had, even now, even with all of it uncertain. You believed him, she said, at the boarding house. You believed him. Yes, so did I. She pressed her hands flat on her knees. I don't think I was wrong about him. Neither do I, James said. But I've been wrong about people before. So have I. She looked at the title records on the desk. If he was honest, those documents in Archer's lockbox are everything. And this is finished. She paused. If he wasn't, what do you have that he didn't know about? James thought. Ed Calloway. Calloway's copies, the ones the recorder had made before Pruitt or Webb or anyone could have known Calloway was keeping records. Those had been in James's hands before Pruitt ever appeared at the boarding house. Pruitt would have known the originals existed, but not that Calloway had duplicate copies, because Calloway had told no one except James and Evelyn. Calloway's copies, James said. Evelyn understood immediately. Pruitt knew about the originals because he prepared them. He didn't know about the copies, which means if Pruitt's set of originals is somehow compromised, if they're not what he said they were, Calloway's copies are independent confirmation. And Calloway himself, she said, his testimony, that's not something Pruitt could have anticipated or controlled. The relief of that was real, and James let himself feel it for exactly a second. Then he folded it back up. We wait for Rourke, he said. We wait for Rourke, she agreed. She stood and went to the door, and then stopped with her hand on the frame and turned back. James, she said. Whatever Pruitt is honest or not, you did the right thing. You went to the families. You went to Archer. You stood on that street and said what needed saying. She held his gaze. That doesn't change based on what Pruitt turns out to be. He looked at her. I know, he said. I'm telling you anyway. I know that, too. He held her gaze. Thank you, Evelyn. She looked at him for one more moment. The light from the window was behind her, and he could not read her expression with precision. But he felt the weight of it, the particular weight of a woman who has spent 3 years giving everything she had to people and places in this valley and expecting nothing back. Suddenly in a house where someone was looking at her, like she mattered. She turned and went back out to the porch. He sat at his desk and looked at 12 years of legitimate title records and waited. Rourke came back 2 hours later. He came alone, which told James something before he opened his mouth. Marshal Archer's compliments, Rourke said. He was catching his breath, clearly had ridden fast both ways. Pruitt is in the Ridgeback jail, sir. James stood up from the desk so fast the chair scraped. "Not arrested," Rourke said quickly. "He asked to be. He rode to Archer this afternoon, before I got there, and told Archer that he'd sent Slade 3 days ago, before he came to your table, and that he hadn't been able to cancel it because he was scared to contact Slade directly without Webb knowing. And he wanted to make sure it was on the record that he'd disclosed it himself before it became a problem." Rourke paused. "Marshall says it's consistent with everything else Pruitt gave him." "He believes him." James put both hands on the desk. He breathed. "And Evelyn said she'd come back inside when she heard the horse." "In custody, ma'am, both of them. Drayden too." Rourke looked between them. "It's done. The marshal says to tell you it's done." The room was very quiet. Then Thomas Carter's voice came from the hallway. "I could hear you all the way from the sitting room." He appeared in the doorway, moving carefully but steadily on his healing arms, and he looked at his son with that contained iron face that never showed more than it intended to. "Well, it's done, Papa," James said. Thomas looked at him for a long moment. Then he looked at Evelyn. "Young woman," he said. She looked at him. "My wife wants to see you. She says she has something to tell you, and she won't tell me what it is, which means it's something sentimental, and she doesn't want me making a face about it." He looked at the floor and then back up. "And I want to say before you go in there that what you did for us. 11 days in that cabin." He stopped. His jaw worked once. "I'm not a man who says certain things easily." "I know," Evelyn said. "I'm saying them anyway." He looked at her directly. "Thank you. Not for the food or the bed, for the talking. At night, when Margaret was frightened." His voice was very level and very controlled, and the control cost him something visible. "She told me what you said to her, the stories, the places you want to see." He paused. "You're going to see them, the ocean and the rest of it. I'm going to make sure of that." Evelyn looked at the old man for a long moment. Then she walked to him and took his bandaged hands, carefully, in both of hers, and held them. Thomas Carter, who had not cried at his own house burning down, looked at the ceiling. James watched his father and this woman standing in the doorway of his office and felt something settle in him that had been unsettled for a very long time, something that had to do with the distance between what he'd built and what it was for. And whether those two things had ever really lined up, and whether they could. He thought they could. He thought, standing in this house that had been too empty and too large and too far from everything that mattered, that it was possible to build the right thing once you understood what right meant. He had not understood it before. He thought he was beginning to. Evelyn let go of Thomas's hands. She went to find Margaret. And Thomas Carter turned to his son and said very quietly, "Don't wait too long. I told you. I know what you told me. I'm telling you, don't wait too long." He fixed his son with a look that had in it 40 years of knowing when to move and when you'd waited past the moment. "Some things don't hold forever, James. Even good things. Even the best things. Go talk to her." "Not tonight." But James looked at his father. "Yes, sir." Thomas nodded once. Then he went back down the hall, slow and careful and absolutely straight-backed, the way he always moved, the way he would always move. And James watched him go and thought that this was what it looked like when a man had nothing left to prove and everything still to live for. He went to the window. Outside, the light was going gold and long across the yard, and somewhere in the house he could hear his mother's voice and Evelyn's voice, too low to make out the words, rising and falling in the particular rhythm of two people who had found each other across space and circumstance that should have kept them separate. He stood there for a long time. He was not a man given to standing still. He had spent 12 years in motion building, acquiring, managing, deciding, moving on to the next thing before the last thing had finished settling. He had called that ambition. He was beginning to understand it had been partly avoidance. You couldn't feel the emptiness of a house if you were always riding away from it. He wasn't riding away. He stood at the window of his office in the golden late afternoon light, with 3 families' worth of hope in his safe, and his parents' voices down the hall, and Evelyn Harper somewhere in his house, and he thought about the ocean she had never seen, and the 12 years he had spent building an empire that had almost been used to take everything from the people he should have been protecting. He thought about what it would take to make that right. Not just the legal part, not just the financial part. Those were the easy parts. They had clear shapes, clear processes, clear ends. The harder part was the part that didn't have a form yet. The part that was about what this house was supposed to be, and who was supposed to be in it, and what a life looked like when you built it around the right things from the ground up, instead of filling it in around the edges, after the fact. He thought he knew. He thought he had known for a while, actually, since somewhere around the 4th night on a saddle blanket near a cabin door, listening to the sound of 3 people breathing. He just needed to find the ground under it first. And the ground, he thought, was almost there. The trial date was set for the 3rd week of September. Webb and Drayden sat in the Ridgeback jail for 6 weeks while Archer's office built the case, and in those 6 weeks James Carter did not slow down for a single day. He hired 2 lawyers out of Helena, men who knew territorial land law the way a surgeon knows anatomy, and he sat with them every morning going through every document, every forgery, every transfer, until he understood the full shape of what had been done with his name. It was worse than he'd initially thought. There were 2 additional properties outside the valley he hadn't known about. A grazing rights scheme that had displaced a ranching family in the county north of Cutter's Creek. A filing with the territorial governor's office that had attempted to reclassify public land adjacent to the Silverhorn Ranch as private trust holdings. Webb had been thorough. James gave him that. He was more thorough. Every morning he was at his desk by 5. Every evening he was still there at 8. Pruitt, who had, in the end, been exactly what he'd appeared to be at that boarding house table. A frightened man trying to find his way back to something he recognized as right, cooperated fully with the prosecution, and provided documentation that filled in every gap Webb's careful forgeries had tried to create. Borden, the Helena clerk, plea bargained his testimony in exchange for a reduced charge. The case against Webb was the kind of case that juries in frontier counties rarely saw fully assembled, and the lawyers said so. James heard it and went back to his desk. He trusted the lawyers. He did not trust that trusting the lawyers was enough. Evelyn stayed at Silverhorn. This was not a simple thing, and both of them understood that it wasn't, and neither of them pretended otherwise. She was not a guest in the soft social sense of the word. She ran the household kitchen alongside Ruth in the mornings, not because anyone asked her to, but because standing still made her restless, and Ruth, it turned out, was glad of the company and the capable hands. She tended Thomas's arms until they were fully healed, a process that took 3 more weeks and involved considerably more argument than the medical situation strictly required. She read to Margaret in the evenings, continuing the habit that had started in the cabin, and the books she chose were the ones she'd always wanted to read properly, with enough light and enough time. And Margaret listened with the focused pleasure of a woman who had decided she was going to enjoy whatever time she had left and was not going to be sentimental about it. The town of Cutter's Creek watched all of this. James knew they were watching because Cutter's Creek was a small town, and small towns watched everything, and he also knew that what they were seeing was not what most of them had expected to see. They had expected, perhaps, that Evelyn Harper would be a temporary arrangement, a woman who'd done a good deed and been rewarded for it, and would eventually go back to her cabin on the hillside, and her 2 goats and her quiet, marginal life, and things would return to their proper order. They were finding out, slowly, and then with increasing certainty, that things were not returning to that particular order. James made sure they found that out clearly. He brought Evelyn to church the 2nd Sunday after the arrest, which was the first Sunday after Margaret was strong enough to go. He did not escort her in the performative way of a man making a point with a woman on his arm. He walked beside her, Equal and easy. The way you walk with someone you've decided is yours to walk beside. And when Dorothea Fitch's husband, a large, florid man named Gerald, who ran the saloon, and had the uncomfortable look of a man whose wife had told him what happened on the street, nodded to him and then to Evelyn and said, "Miss Harper." "Good to see you." James said nothing. He just let it land, let the town watch it land, and moved on. The Hendersons came to church that Sunday too, and the Garretts. The Moore family sat 2 rows behind. Nobody said anything unpleasant to Evelyn Harper that Sunday. Nobody said anything unpleasant to her the following Sunday either. The Sunday after that, Clara Henderson sat beside her. Small things. But they were the kind of small things that built the new shape of something, and James understood that shape better now than he ever had. He'd spent 12 years building the large visible shape of things, the ranch, the operation, the reputation, and had been so focused on the large and visible that he'd missed the small and structural. The small structural things were what held. The rest was just what people saw from the outside. 3 weeks before the trial, the first of the land restorations was complete. The Henderson property, 42 acres of good valley land with water access, returned by territorial court order to Frank and Clara Henderson, the fraudulent transfer reversed on the basis of the forged documentation and Pruitt's testimony. James heard about it from his lawyer on a Tuesday afternoon and went directly to find Evelyn. She was in the kitchen garden. She'd started one at Silverhorn because the kitchen garden at her cabin had been good, and she was a woman who fed people and needed things growing to feel right about the world. She looked up when he came through the gate and read his face before he said a word. "The Hendersons," she said. "Yes." She pressed both hands against her sides, the same gesture Clara Henderson had made. James noticed and understood that it was the gesture of a woman holding herself together around something too big to let out all at once. Bowl, 42 acres. Clean title, no encumbrances. He paused. "Clara's going to plant winter wheat." Evelyn looked at the garden. Then she pressed the back of her wrist to her eyes, once fast, and looked back at him with clear eyes and a lifted chin and said, "Good. That's good land for winter wheat." He looked at her for a moment. "It is," he said. The Garrett and Moore restorations followed within the week. The ranching family from the county north took longer, an additional court proceeding, a more complicated chain of title, but by the time the trial began it was underway, and James's lawyers had filed the necessary papers for the public land reclassification to be reversed. The trial lasted 4 days. James testified on the second day. He sat in the witness chair of the Ridgeback Courthouse and answered questions for 2 hours, with the deliberate, specific precision of a man who had spent 6 weeks making absolutely certain he knew every fact he was going to be asked about. He did not look at Webb, who sat at the defendant's table, with the contained, watchful expression of a man who had made a calculation and was still waiting to see if it would pay. He did not look at Drayden, who had the look of a man who had made a smaller calculation in service of a larger one and was beginning to understand which direction it had landed. He looked at the jury, 12 men who lived in this territory, who knew the land and what it meant to hold it and what it meant to have it taken. He told them the truth, all of it, including the parts that made him look careless and inattentive and too distant from the edges of his own operation. He did not soften those parts. His lawyers had suggested he might want to, and he'd told them no. When he stepped down, Evelyn was in the gallery behind the bar. She looked at him as he passed, and what was in her face was not pity and not pride, exactly, but something that lived in the country between them, respect and recognition, and something warmer than either, something she was still being careful with. The way you're careful with a thing you don't want to break, by handling it before the time is right. He sat down beside his father. Thomas Carter was looking straight ahead, his jaw set, his hands folded on his knees. "Well done," Thomas said, very quiet. Just the 2 words. James nodded once. Pruitt testified on the 3rd day. He was methodical and precise and visibly frightened, and told the truth without decoration, and when Webb's defense lawyer tried to suggest that Pruitt had engineered the entire scheme independently, and Webb had been deceived, Pruitt looked at the man with the exhausted clarity of someone who has been through enough that performance no longer seems worth the effort and said, "No, that isn't what happened. What I've told this court is what happened. I have nothing left to protect by saying otherwise." The jury deliberated for 6 hours. Webb guilty on 9 counts. Drayden guilty on 6. Borden, the Helena clerk, had already pled. 2 additional associates identified through the trial proceedings faced separate charges. Pruitt received a suspended sentence and a fine and 3 years of supervised legal practice, which his daughter's expression in the gallery suggested she considered an acceptable outcome. James heard the verdict standing in the courtroom and felt not triumph wasn't the right word, but something more like the sensation of a weight that had been wrongly placed finally being set down in the right location. Not gone, just right. He turned to look for Evelyn. She wasn't in the gallery. He found her outside, standing in the street, looking east toward the mountains. He came and stood beside her and said nothing for a moment because she was clearly in the middle of something interior, and he had learned enough about her to know when to wait. "It's over," she said finally. "The trial, yes." She turned to look at him. "That's not what I meant." He looked back at her. "I mean this part. The crisis part. The part where everything was urgent, and there was always something to be done next and no time to think about anything except the next thing." She held his gaze. "That part is over." "Yes, it is." She was quiet for a moment. The street around them was doing its normal business, people moving, horses, the ordinary sounds of a town that had just witnessed something significant and was already processing it to the texture of daily life. That was how it worked. You moved through the extraordinary, and then ordinary life continued, and you had to figure out where you stood in it. "What happens to me now?" she said. She said it plainly, without self-pity, just the direct asking of a direct question, the way she did everything. "My cabin needs work. My goat is at your ranch. I've been somewhere I wasn't sure I belonged for 6 weeks. She paused. "I need to know where I am." James looked at her. This was the moment his father had told him not to wait past. He had not been waiting exactly. He had been doing what she'd told him to do, finding the ground first. And the ground was there now, solid and clear and fully visible, no fog of crisis or urgency obscuring the shape of it. "You belong at Silverhorn," he said. She looked at him carefully. "Not as a guest," he said. "Not as someone who's there because the situation made it practical." He held her gaze without flinching. "As mine, if you'll have me." The street continued around them. A wagon went past. Somebody's dog barked twice and stopped. Evelyn stood very still. "James," she said, "I know what I'm saying. You've known me 6 weeks. I've known you in 6 weeks the way most people don't know each other in 6 years," he said. "I've seen you keep 2 elderly people alive with what you had. I've seen you stand on a road in the dark in front of 4 armed men and not step back. I've seen you eat 1 biscuit when you needed 3 and argue my father into taking care of himself and tell me the truth when the truth was inconvenient." He paused. "I know who you are, Evelyn. 6 weeks was enough." She looked at him for a long time. "I'm not going to change," she said finally. "I'm not going to become someone who fits in a house like that easily. I'm going to keep a kitchen garden and argue about things and feed people whether they want feeding or not." "Good," he said. "I'm counting on it. I have opinions about how things should be run." "I've noticed. Strong opinions. I've noticed that too." Her mouth almost moved toward a smile. "Almost. You think you can live with that?" "I think," he said, "that I've been needing someone to tell me the truth and argue with me and make me account for myself for a very long time. And that you are the only person I've ever met who does it without making me feel small while you're doing it." He held her gaze. "So yes, I think I can live with it." She looked at him. And then she said, "Yes," just the one word. Clean and clear and without hesitation, the way she said everything when she'd made up her mind. He reached out and took her hand, her capable, work-worn, entirely unadorned hand, and held it, and she let him. and they stood on the street of Ridgeback in the October morning, with the verdict still warm from the courtroom and the rest of their lives arranged in front of them, like open country. "Your mother is going to be insufferable about this," Evelyn said. "She already knows," James said. "She told me to stop being slow about it 2 weeks ago." Evelyn looked at him. 2 weeks ago. She said, and I'm quoting directly, that she hadn't held on through the fever and the smoke and a month of recovery to watch her son be a coward about a woman who was clearly the best thing that had happened to this family in years. A beat of silence. Then Evelyn laughed. A real laugh. The full kind. The kind he had heard her give precisely twice before. And that was still, both times, like something opening unexpectedly in a closed room. She pressed her free hand to her mouth and laughed, and he stood there, holding her other hand, and watched it and felt something in his chest do the thing it had been doing since the 4th morning in that cabin. The thing he'd been carefully not calling by its right name until he had the ground under him. He had the ground now. He was calling it by its right name. They rode back to Silverhorn together, and Margaret Carter met them at the door with the expression of a woman who had already known and was simply waiting for confirmation. She looked at their faces and then looked at their hands and then said to no one in particular finally, "Thomas, from somewhere behind her, I told him not to wait too long." "You told him," Margaret said. "I told him 3 weeks before that." "You told him to act like it. That's different from telling him not to wait." "It is not different, Thomas. It is considerably different." James looked at Evelyn. She looked back at him with those steady brown eyes, warm now with something she wasn't hiding anymore, and shook her head slowly in the way of a person who is finding something funnier than the situation strictly calls for. "This is what you're choosing," she said quietly. "Just so you're clear." "I'm clear," he said. "Your parents arguing about things that don't matter while your mother is technically always right." "She is technically always right," he agreed. She looked at him a moment longer. Then she walked past him through the door and into the house, and he heard her say to Margaret, "He says you're always right," and heard his mother say, "Of course I am. Now come and sit down and tell me everything," and heard Thomas make a sound of profound philosophical disagreement from the sitting room. He stood on the porch for a moment. The October air was clean and cold, and the ranch spread out around him the way it always had, the same buildings and the same land and the same mountains in the distance. None of it had changed. All of it looked different. He thought about a cabin 11 miles west with a charred corner on the lean-to and a kitchen garden going dormant for winter, and a loft where a woman had slept on a folded quilt while 2 elderly strangers took the only bed. He was going to fix the lean-to. He was going to do it himself with his own hands, the way his grandfather would have. He was going to plant the kitchen garden in spring, a proper one, twice the size of the current one, because Evelyn Harper fed people, and always would, and she should have enough growing to do it right. There were things he was going to build, the right way this time. On the right foundation, for the right reasons. He was looking forward to every one of them. Inside, the voices continued, Margaret explaining something, Thomas disagreeing on principle, Evelyn's voice steady and warm in the middle of it all like an anchor. The stove was going. Ruth would have supper on by 6. The ranch was quiet around it, settled into its own rhythms. And somewhere in the south paddock a goat was expressing an opinion about the evening in the strident and entirely self-assured way of a creature that had survived everything thrown at it and fully expected to survive everything to come. James Carter walked through his own front door. He hung up his coat and his hat and went to find the woman who had taught him the difference between being rich and being wealthy, between having much and giving much, between building an empire and building a life, and he sat down beside her at the table, where his family argued and ate and told stories about dresses that were definitely tea blue, absolutely green, and he was exactly where he was supposed to be. In the weeks that followed, Cutter's Creek found itself doing something it had not done gracefully in a long time. It adjusted. The adjustment came in small pieces. Clara Henderson brought a pie to Evelyn at Silverhorn on the first Saturday of November and stayed 3 hours. The women who had stood on the boardwalk with Dorothea Fitch were conspicuously polite at the next church social, which was not warmth, but was the beginning of something that could become warmth if given time and no further provocation. Marta Collins at the general store said to a customer, within hearing of two other customers, that she had always thought Evelyn Harper was a fine woman, and nobody who heard it said otherwise. Because nobody wanted to be on the wrong side of this particular history. Dorothea Fitch said nothing about Evelyn Harper for a considerable period of time. That was, in its way, the loudest thing she'd ever said. Ed Calloway, the land recorder in Ridgeback, who had kept copies when he didn't know what else to do, and told the truth when he finally had someone to tell it to, was quietly recommended by James to the territorial governor's office as a man of integrity and reliable record. He was given a formal commendation in December and used the occasion to thank, in his brief remarks, the people of Cutter's Creek Valley for their patience with his office. He did not name names, but he looked at the third row where Evelyn was sitting, and he tipped his head, and she nodded back. Pruitt sent a letter in November. It was addressed to James and Evelyn both, and it was short, careful, and honest, which was consistent with everything else about the man. He said he was back in Helena. He said his daughter had started school. He said he hoped the valley was recovering. He said he was sorry, without elaboration or excuse, and signed it with his full name. James read it and passed it to Evelyn, who read it and set it on the desk and said, "Answer it." "What do I say?" She looked at him. "Tell him the valley is recovering. Tell him his daughter should see the ocean someday." She paused. "Tell him it's not finished until a man decides it is." James wrote back. Thomas Carter's arms healed completely by the end of October. He marked the occasion by going out to the South Paddock, introducing himself formally to Evelyn's goat, a process that took 20 minutes and involved considerable mutual assessment, and then coming back inside and announcing that the animal had character and he intended to get 2 more. Margaret said, "You are not getting goats, Thomas." Thomas said, "They're practical. We have 47 ranch hands. And now we'd have goats." He sat down. "The girl likes them." Margaret looked at Evelyn. Evelyn said very carefully, "I do appreciate goats." Thomas spread his hands as if the matter were settled. Margaret looked at the ceiling. Then she looked at her son with the look that meant, "This is your household and I am choosing not to intervene." James nodded diplomatically and said nothing. They got 2 goats in November. Thomas named them both. He did it with the air of a man who considered the task beneath him and did it anyway, with considerable thoroughness. On the morning of the 22nd of November, 4 months and 11 days after James Carter had knocked a small cabin door at midnight and held out money to a woman who didn't want it, the Henderson family broke ground on the winter wheat. Clara sent word to Silverhorn the evening before, and James read the note at supper and passed it to Evelyn without comment. She read it. Then she looked at the table for a moment, at nothing in particular, with the expression of someone listening to something interior. Then she said, "I want to be there." "I know," James said. "Is that—" "We'll ride out at first light," he said. She looked at him. "I know what matters to you," he said simply. "That matters to you. So we'll be there." She held his gaze for a moment. Then she looked down at her plate. Thomas Carter looked at his son across the table with the expression of a man who is not going to say, "I told you so," but is thinking it with considerable satisfaction. They rode out at first light. The Henderson land was cold and clear, and Frank Henderson was already in the field with his oldest son when they arrived, turning the first furrow of ground for the winter wheat. And Clara Henderson came out of the house when she heard the horses and looked at Evelyn, and they held each other in the middle of the yard for a long moment without either of them saying a word, because there wasn't a word that covered what the moment was. James stood back and let it be what it was. He looked at the turned earth. Good valley land, exactly as the documents had described it, with the water access that made it worth taking and worth fighting to take back. He thought about forgeries and courtrooms and 6 weeks of his lawyer's time and the look on Frank Henderson's face in the Ridgeback courthouse when the verdict came in and Clara pressed both hands against her sides and held herself together. Worth it. Every hour of it. Frank Henderson came over and shook James's hand. Not the hand of a man who had forgiven. Forgiveness was a longer process than 4 months, but the hand of a man who was willing to begin. Good land, James said, Frank said. Always was. James nodded. They rode back to Silverhorn in the late morning, and Evelyn was quiet most of the way in the manner of someone carrying something full and not wanting to spill it by talking too much. He rode beside her and let her be quiet, because that was one of the things he had learned, that her silences were not distances. They were rooms she let you into if you didn't push the door. A mile from home she said, "I want to see the ocean." He looked at her. "Your father told me I was going to." She kept her eyes on the road ahead. "He told me he was going to make sure of it. I've been thinking about that for weeks." She paused. "I've never been past Montana in my life. I've never seen water that goes all the way to the edge of the sky." "San Francisco," he said immediately. "Spring if the trail permits. We can take my parents. My mother has been wanting to go for years and my father will agree to it eventually if we frame it as practical." She looked at him sideways. "How do you frame San Francisco as practical?" "I have a business contact there. I'll work it in." She almost smiled. "You're going to invent a business reason to take your wife to the ocean." "I have a contact," he said. "The business reason is genuine. The order of priority is flexible." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Your wife. If you'd prefer a different word." "No," she said it quietly, but with the particular weight of a word she'd turned over and found solid all the way through. "No, that word is right." He looked at her. She looked back at him with those steady brown eyes, warm and clear and entirely unguarded in the morning light, and for a moment neither of them said anything because there wasn't anything to add to it. The word was right. They were married in December on a Saturday. In the church at Cutter's Creek, with the pews fuller than they'd been in 2 years, and Thomas Carter in the front row with his 2 healed arms folded across his chest and an expression of studied composure that fooled nobody. And Margaret beside him with no studied composure whatsoever because she had decided at 65 that she was done performing about things that moved her. Clara Henderson was there, and the Garrett's, and the Moores. And Ed Calloway, who had ridden 12 miles in December cold, because he'd been asked, and because some things you ride 12 miles for. And Alma Birch, who cried from the second hymn onward and did not apologize for it. Dorothea Fitch was there too. She sat in the middle of the church with her husband, and she did not smile, and she did not make a scene, and she gave, at the reception after, a brief and correct congratulations that cost her something visible. That was enough. James shook Gerald Fitch's hand and said thank you for coming, and meant it, because a town that shows up even when it costs something is a better town than one that only shows up easy. Evelyn wore a dress that was the color of winter sky blue-gray, Margaret said. With the absolute certainty of a woman whose opinion on the color of dresses was not open for discussion, and she stood in the front of that church and made promises in the clear, direct voice of a person who does not make promises she doesn't intend to keep. James made the same promises. He intended to keep everyone. At the reception, Thomas Carter stood up without warning, without being asked, without announcement, and said, in the particular voice of a man who speaks rarely enough that people listen when he does, "My son built something large." And he very nearly let it become the wrong thing. A young woman with almost nothing showed him what he had and what he was missing, and she did it without asking anything in return and without making him feel small for the missing. He stopped. He looked at Evelyn. "I have never met a person of more genuine quality. And I have known a few." He raised his glass. "This family got better the day she walked into it." That is the plain truth of it. The room was very quiet. Then Clara Henderson started to clap, and it spread, and the reception in the church hall of Cutter's Creek was loud for a good long minute. Evelyn looked at the table. James put his hand over hers. She turned it over and held it. Later, much later. After the guests had gone and his parents had retired, and the hall was quiet, they sat together on the porch of Silverhorn in the December cold with blankets around them, and the stars very bright and very close the way Montana stars are in winter. And Evelyn said, "I still don't entirely understand how we got here." "From that cabin," he said. "From me not wanting your money," she said. To this he considered. "You said it wasn't about money." "I had to figure out what it was about." He paused. "Took me a little while." "A little while," she said. "You slept on my floor for 3 weeks. I was a slow learner." She looked at the sky. "You were not slow," she said quietly. "You just needed someone to stop moving long enough that you could catch up to what mattered." She paused. "You were moving very fast. For a very long time, away from things." "Yes," he said, "you're not moving away anymore, no." He looked at her profile in the dark, at the particular way she held herself straight and open and entirely present, the way she always was. The way she'd been since the moment she'd opened Borkhaben and said you'd be James, like she already knew everything she needed to know. "I'm exactly where I mean to be." She turned and looked at him. "Good," she said. Then she leaned into him, easy and deliberate and completely without apology, and he put his arm around her and held on. And they sat together in the Montana winter with the stars above them and the ranch quiet around them, and a goat making a lefalafalkif noise from the south paddock. And everything that had been wrong was not fixed. The world did not work that way, and neither of them believed it did, but everything that mattered was in its right place, solid and true and built on ground that was going to hold. Evelyn Harper had arrived in this valley with nothing but her hands and her character, and a willingness to give both without counting the cost. She had saved 2 lives, restored 3 families to their land, and quietly, without trying to, changed the direction of a man who had been moving too fast in the wrong direction for far too long. She never did it for recognition. She never did it for reward. She did it because she was made of the particular kind of strength that does not need an audience and does not keep a ledger and does not stop being itself because the world has decided it isn't worth much. The world had been wrong about Evelyn Harper. This valley knew it now. This man knew it. And the life they built together, from that December morning forward, the kitchen garden and the goats and the Henderson wheat and San Francisco trip in spring and the table full of people and the voices arguing about things that didn't matter. And the things that did was the proof of it, laid down day by day, solid and warm and entirely real. Some people come into your life quietly and change everything. She was that kind of person. And James Carter, who had spent 12 years building an empire and 1 season learning what it was actually for, would spend every year that followed making sure she knew it, not in grand gestures, not in the language of wealth and power that had always come most easily to him, but in the small daily choosing of her, again and again. The way you tend something you understand is rare. That is how a rich man becomes a wealthy one. That is how a house becomes a home. And that is how Evelyn Harper, the woman this town had looked through for 3 years, the woman who had given everything she had to people who needed it more, the woman who had stood at a cabin door in the Montana dark and told a powerful man to put his money away, became exactly who she had always been, seen at last by a world that had finally learned to look.